The Last of Us game series is one of the most loved gaming series ever released, selling almost 30 million copies worldwide, being a top-selling video game for 2 separate consoles, becoming an example to the world just how far gaming technology and cinematics has come. But how did it get here? Let's find out. Naughty Dog is one of the most recognizable and loved first-party video game developers in the world, and Naughty Dog has been creating these amazing gaming experiences for almost 4 decades. Even after the company's purchase from Sony in 2001, Naughty Dog's quality hasn't disappeared, and that is most likely due to how Naughty Dog is ran. Naughty Dog is known for its unique way of handling game development, as the studio does not have a producer in either of their teams. The work culture at Naughty Dog is very different from many other studios, as it is said that there is less middle management. The studio's lead effects artist, Keith Garrett, goes into more detail on this, saying, "It comes with a lot of pros and cons, but I think it definitely is one of our biggest strengths. Looking around at the rest of the industry, and this is something that we do talk about quite a bit, the companies that are doing really innovative, cool things are all the ones that don't have the management, like the business side, directly interjected into the company. Sony put us in this fantastic situation where we don't have any producers. We don't have any interactions with Sony corporate at all on the development. Because of this, Naughty Dog has complete freedom in almost every aspect of game development, and that also means that Sony does not prevent the studio from any implementation of game elements. And this is probably the reason why Naughty Dog has been able to create so many loved gaming franchises, like Jak and Daxter, Uncharted, and of course the classic Crash Bandicoot. But there is one game series that, as of late, has been getting the bulk of Naughty Dog's attention, and on a personal level, a game series that is my first and only game I've ever pre-ordered, and that game being the action-adventure game The Last of Us. And while this gaming series is very well known, loved, and even somewhat controversial, it actually started out as something entirely different. I should probably start with the preliminary work on The Last of Us, under the codename Project Thang, or T1, began after the release of Uncharted 2 Among Thieves in October of 2009. For the first time in the company's history, developer Naughty Dog split into 2 teams to work on projects concurrently. While one team developed Uncharted 3, the other began to work on a new project. In order to run the 2 teams smoothly, co-presidents Evan Wells and Christoph Balestra chose game director Bruce Straley and creative director Neil Druckmann to lead development and lead writer on the development of this new game. Straley, who was employed at Naughty Dog in March of 1999, was selected to lead the project based on his experience and his work on previous projects, while Druckmann, an employee since 2004, was chosen for his determination and talent for design about a year into the game's production. Along with these 2 was Jacob Minkoff as lead designer, Christian Nakata as lead environment artist, Nate Wells as lead artist, Eben Cook as lead visual effects artist, Michael Hatfield as lead technical artist, Phil Kovacs as audio lead, Sean Askeig as lead cinematic animator, Michael Noland as lead character artist, David Lamb as lead cinematic animator, Mike Yosh as lead gameplay animator, Jason Gregory and Travis McIntosh were both lead programmers, and the music was composed by award-winning composer Gustavo Santaolalla, along with compositions by Andrew Buresh, Anthony Caruso, and Jonathan Mayer. And this was just a fraction of the team that was set to create this new game, as there were hundreds of other employees who put work into this new game. And while this talented team was set to work on the new game, they were tasked with rebooting a loved Naughty Dog franchise. Jak and Daxter. However, as the team went back and looked at Jak and Daxter's franchise and creating concept art, the team began asking questions about why they were doing this, and asking if they were doing this just for marketing. As Neil Druckmann explains in an IGDA Toronto chapter event.
And as much as we liked a lot of these concepts and kind of exploring this fantastical world, we found that the ideas we're passionate about were kind of getting away from what Jak and Daxter was, and we're questioning is like, are we doing this for marketing reason and naming something Jak and Daxter when it's not really Jak and Daxter? Or are we really passionate about it? And the answer was like, we felt it was more for marketing. And we just, again, we felt like we weren't doing service to what the fans of this franchise really liked, even if the reinvented Daxter is pretty damn good looking. So we went to our boss and said, do we have to do this? And he said, no. I thought it would just be easier for you guys if you started with something, but if you want to do something else, come up with something else. So we're like, awesome. And we left the office, and Bruce and I looked at each other and we're like, okay, now what do we do?
And with that, the team came to the conclusion that they weren't passionate about rebooting the Jak and Daxter series. And with the question of now what do we do, Neil Druckmann had to go back to when he was attending university in 2004 as a student at the Carnegie Mellon University. And while he was attending, his professor was a friend of a man who was pretty much responsible for creating one of entertainment's most successful genres. Druckmann's professor was a friend of George A. Romero, the famous filmmaker of The Night of the Living Dead. He is often credited for being a major contributor to the image of the zombie in modern culture. So he is pretty much the reason why we even have shows like The Walking Dead or video games like Left 4 Dead. The huge rise in popularity of zombies is basically because of him. Back to Druckmann, while he was attending this class, they were assigned to get into groups for a project, simply called Project NOTLD, which stood for Night of the Living Dead. So the group would create a Night of the Living Dead styled game that they would pitch to George A. Romero himself, and he would pick one. Druckmann's idea was to merge the gameplay of the 2001 action-adventure game Ico in a story set during a zombie apocalypse, like that of Romero's Night of the Living Dead, with the lead character similar to John Hartigan from Sin City. The lead character, a police officer, would be tasked with protecting a young girl. However, due to the lead character's heart condition, the player would often assume control of the young girl, reversing the roles. The ending of the game would have had the girl having to shoot the police officer, as he would have been bitten by a zombie as well. And while the premise would be very intriguing, George Romero decided to go with another project instead. And while this project and its characters would be shelved, they would come back to Neil years later. In the meantime, while Neil was working for Naughty Dog as a programmer, he became very interested in writing and storytelling. And while he couldn't express his storytelling as just a programmer, he could in his spare time. And these characters he created came back to him. So he decided in his spare time to flesh out the characters and create a comic book called The Turning. The story was very similar to what his college project was, but with more fleshed out characters and story. Again, I will let him explain.
So I started Naughty Dog as a programmer slash wannabe designer slash wannabe writer. And at the time I was reading a lot about storytelling. I was reading that book by Robert McKee. And I was really hungry for just writing. And I remember those characters back from when I was a student, and I was really drawn to them. And I was like, okay, well, what's another way I can explore those characters? I can't do it as a programmer. What if I do a comic book? So I was like, okay, I kind of like scrapped a lot of the ideas and just kept that core concept of having this strong kind of guardian character and then this female character where the roles at some point would switch. And I really kind of liked that idea. So this was take 2. And I decided I was going to write it and draw it all myself in my spare time. It was called The Turning. And it was about now, like, I developed the characters a little bit more, and the dude was now a criminal who's lost his daughter, and in trying to protect this girl, he was trying to redeem his past, because in a lot of ways, his past was responsible for his daughter's death. And again, it was mostly about him trying to get this girl to safety. At some point, his past catches up with him, with his business partner. He gets tortured. She ends up killing the guy. And again, the roles switch where she becomes the savior. So I put this whole pitch together. I had a bunch of pages drawn. I had the script for like a 6-issue arc. I pitched it to an indie publisher, and he said, I like it, but I don't love it. Ultimately, I'm going to have to pass.
And as sad as this is, again, the concept had to be shelved. And while this idea was collecting dust, Neil became a designer for Naughty Dog, working on the popular Uncharted series. And while working on Uncharted 2, Bruce Straley and Neil Druckmann would watch the BBC documentary Planet Earth. And this is where the duo would learn about the cordyceps fungi. Most of these cordyceps fungi are parasitoids, which are organisms that live in close association with their hosts at the host's expense, eventually resulting in the death of the host. There are many ways this can be seen in nature, but in the documentary, it is shown that an ant was exposed to this fungi spores, and then the cordyceps took over the ant's brain functions. They would then have the ant climb and rest at a high point, and then the cordyceps fungi will grow out of the ant's body. It would be decided that the game would explore the concept of cordyceps-like fungi that would evolve and start infecting humans instead of just insects. The game would not directly explain the cause of the virus. Bruce Straley attributed this to the team's focus on characters, as opposed to the virus. They will instead go on to explain the events through subtext rather than explicitly explaining the cause of the infection. Straley compared the subtext included in The Last of Us to that of BioShock Infinite in 2013. He felt that the latter had spawned various conversations within the industry, which he saw as a sign of a maturing industry. As he put it in a Venture Beat interview, I've seen enough good stories in books and film. Now I want to see them in video games. The team would go on to use the concept of infected to force the player to explore the limits of human preservation. Throughout the development, however, the team assured everyone that the infected were strictly different from zombies. And all of this would come up in talks between Neil and Bruce, and eventually all of these ideas would culminate together into a game. So instead of a reimagining of Jak and Daxter, Neil and Bruce would take all of these elements and create a new game for Naughty Dog. And this game would originally be called Mankind. And while this game would be similar to what The Last of Us would be, with having these cordyceps jump from insects to people, infecting them and creating monsters, a big difference from the original would be that this infection would only infect women, except for one woman, who you would have to protect. However, this idea did not last, as Naughty Dog allowed all employees to speak their minds, and the female employees were not happy with this idea. Again, as Neil explains from the previously mentioned IGDA Toronto chapter video.
The cordyceps has jumped from insects to people, and the people it infects, it can kind of create monsters or kill them. But the twist, the thing that was different about this idea was that it only infected women. And you found the one girl that it didn't infect, and that was Ellie. And you kind of protected her and tried to like bring her to this lab where they were kind of finding a cure. And there were a lot of things that we were really excited about this idea, but ultimately it failed. And the reason it failed is because it was a misogynistic idea. And it's hard for me to say, and I'm kind of airing some dirty laundry here, but I'm really proud that at Naughty Dog we have this really flat structure where people can speak up. If they don't like ideas or the story isn't working or gameplay isn't working, someone can say something. And a lot of the female workers at Naughty Dog came up and said, I don't like this idea. I understand what you're trying to do, that it is ultimately a story about the love of a girl, but the way it's coming off is you have a bunch of women turning into monsters and you're shooting them in the face. So I had a lot of attachments to the idea and I refused to kind of let it go, but eventually I did have this kind of awakening and I realized that was not good. So that got scrapped.
With this early idea for the game, where the infection would only spread to women, was later deemed misogynistic, causing it to be scrapped. Neil and Bruce overcame this, and were still hard at work on what the story was going to be. And over the next few months, they both worked within one room, picking and choosing what ideas they wanted to keep for the story. And from these months of picking and choosing, they came up with what the story would be for this new game. and they then pitched this to the bosses at Naughty Dog. However, while this story pitch matched a lot of what we see in the finished product today, it was not exactly the same, with characters having different characteristics, motives, and even with a somewhat different ending. And this was why the first pitch failed, as the motives of the characters really didn't make much sense, and these motives and actions were often questioned by the team. Some of these ideas that were questioned were about the speed in which Joel began to care for Ellie, and the character Tess actually playing a more of an antagonistic role within the story. In this first pitch, Tess would pursue Joel and Ellie across the country due to Joel accidentally causing the death of her brother after saving Ellie from execution by a group of soldiers. Tess was initially meant to capture Joel and be killed by Ellie, though this was scrapped, as the developers felt it was unrealistic for Tess to pursue Joel with her gang of smugglers for an entire year. Some of the other differences that were changed revolved around both main characters, as Joel and Ellie were originally going to be father and daughter, but Druckmann stated that this was scrapped because the relationship wouldn't have had anywhere to go. He also stated at that point he'd be willing to do anything for his daughter, because that is what any dad would do for his daughter. Neil often cited that becoming a father himself during production inspired him to focus on the bond between parent and child. Introducing Ellie to Joel would give both Joel and the player the same relationship to Ellie and thus enable it to expand from there. This is because the developers were emphasizing personality and character. Another idea that came up during production was Ellie actually being a male, but this was quickly scrapped. And as the story kept getting picked apart, Neil would attempt to hold on to a lot of these ideas from the first script, but eventually he listened to the team, and he agreed that changes needed to be made with the characters' roles and motives. Neil would go into more detail on cutting parts from the game in this IBT Times interview. We had entire cutscenes that were animated and finished, but people would come up to me and say, this would be better if it was playable, and we would end up throwing away all the work and recapturing it all. We toyed, in fact, with even cutting the infected out completely, because they were taking us into things we wanted to avoid. We had to throw away big parts. Even if it was fun gameplay, if it was breaking the reality, we'd remove it. That's the policy at Naughty Dog. Nothing is precious. Moving on, with all these changes, it was decided that the ending needed to be changed as well. Sorta. The original pitch ending still featured the ending that was in the final product, but in the pitch ending, there was another conflict to face afterwards. However, as mentioned previously, this conflict would have needed Tess to be that antagonistic character. Other characters that were changed during writing was the character Marlene, who changed from a doctor who knew of Ellie's infection into the leader of the Fireflies. And the cannibals you encounter in the game were originally classified as the worst of mankind. They would eventually become more fleshed out once Nolan North, who is also the voice actor of Nathan Drake from Uncharted, secured the role as the cannibal David. And while there was plenty of stuff going on within Naughty Dog that was affecting the game and its story, there was also a lot of stuff happening outside of the gaming development that was affecting the game as well. Firstly, as mentioned previously, Neil became a father to a girl. And it is very true when they say becoming a parent will change you. And Neil, who came up with this story by being inspired by media he consumed around him, he began to wonder what media would his own daughter consume, and how it would shape her. And when he looked around at the female characters within the games and other forms of media, he was not pleased. Again, I will let him explain.
So this is me with my daughter at Comic-Con this year. And the thing with Comic-Con is it's kind of like this magical thing where you have comic books and toys and TV shows, and it kind of is a reminder of why I became a game designer, why I joined video games. And as my daughter gets older and kind of becomes her own little person, I get to see more and more of the world through her eyes. And I wonder what are going to be her inspirations, what are the things that she's going to be kind of really attracted to and attached to as she grows up. And as a game creator, I look around at kind of what we are making and what are going to be her role models from the stories, and I don't like what I see. More specifically, I'm talking about our female characters, and whether we want to admit it or not, these are role models. And yet we sexualize, we objectify, we marginalize, and we reduce these female characters to a lot less than they can be. And this is coming from a guy that almost made a really misogynistic game. So I kind of know what I'm talking about. So once this thing failed and I had this awakening, almost exactly at the same time, this Kickstarter happened, about the tropes versus women in video games. And while you might argue with the way it delivers its message or whether every point is exact, you can't argue with just the pattern that you see in the industry. So I was really intrigued by this. The videos for the video games hadn't come out yet, but I watched the rest of Anita's videos, and I realized it's not just a problem in games, it's actually throughout entertainment.
And because of this, Neil began reading books from the author Peggy Orenstein, which opened his eyes to just how we can be shaped by the media we intake, and it showed him how females view themselves based on how they are portrayed within media. So Neil then secretly made it his goal to create one of the coolest non-sexualized female protagonists. Neil wanted to create a role model that anyone could look up to, but someone they wouldn't sexualize or objectify. Someone that his daughter, any female, or anyone who can relate to Ellie would look up to as a positive role model. Continuing on with development, the team wanted to make this game as realistic as possible. And in order to do this, the team conducted extensive research for the setting, taking influences from Alan Wiseman's The World Without Us from 2007. The Last of Us team planned to create a world that would force players to make decisions and utilize their limited supplies effectively. In his research, Druckmann found inspiration in real historical events, such as the 1918 Spanish flu pandemic, which illustrated the depths of self-protection and paranoia capable by humans under threat of extinction, while the polio epidemic of the 1880s demonstrated the influences of socio-economic classes when assigning blame in a great disaster. Druckmann and Straley have also cited Amy Hennigs, who was the head writer and creative director on the Uncharted series, and dedication to characters as an inspiration for the game's story. The team also took inspiration from the 2013 film Gravity, in terms of the game's simplicity and intensity. Which, by the way, Gravity is one of my favorite films. You should totally watch it. And when speaking about realism within the game, the team needed to make an environment as real and immersive as possible. In regards to location choice, Druckmann revealed in an interview in January of 2018 with Academy of Interactive Arts and Sciences that Bruce Straley and the art directors primarily chose locations through concept art and Google Images to best match the emotional tone Druckmann had set at various points in the story. Although Druckmann himself ensured Pittsburgh was included because he personally lived there, and George Romero shot Night of the Living Dead there, which he felt solidified the zombie apocalypse theme within the game. Druckmann also revealed that he felt it was important to create the game through a number of influences beyond simply games, such as books, films, comics, and even personal experiences to make the game more than mere entertainment. When writing the script, Druckmann tried to exclude any fancy dialogue, to keep everything short and natural. Community strategist Eric Monicelli has stated that the narrative's overreaching themes are love, loyalty, and redemption, assuring their abhorrence in the game. And fellow community strategist Arne Meyer said that the game's violence fit the narrative. Straley reiterated this, stating, "You have to have the dark to have the light." Game designer Anthony Newman stated that the game deals with how people would react under pressure in extreme situations, which is represented through the violence and combat. The team felt interested in the story's dark themes, juxtaposed against the beautiful settings. When designing the game from an artistic viewpoint, the team looked at various pieces of work as inspiration, such as Robert Polidori's photographs of the lower Ninth Ward following Hurricane Katrina were used as a reference point when designing the flooded areas of Pittsburgh. Bruce Straley went into more detail about Robert Polidori's photographs, saying, "Polidori did these amazing, beautiful, horrific photos. It's not just decay and rot and post-apocalyptic gray. It's a human world that we're playing with when we are portraying this destruction." The concept of a post-apocalyptic environment was considered a starting point for the artists. The art team also strived to achieve realism within every piece of art. Straley would go on to explain that the artist would be like, "I'm going to make this the most awesome fucking wall ever," in terms of creating attractive environments. The art department were forced to fight for things they wished to include, due to the high demand during development. Ultimately, the team settled on a balance between simplicity and detail. While Straley and Druckmann preferred the former, the art team preferred the latter. The artistic composition of the game's location was also a feature strongly focused on, in order to evoke varying emotion from players. In the final weeks of development, roles from the art department were undertaken by other members of the team. For example, Straley hand-arranged the text on the game's training screens, a task that lead artist Nate Wells found unusual. As he put it, "I've never heard of a game director doing that. It's like an intern task. But with the team doing their best to make the environments as real as possible, they are also hard at work making the enemies that fill these realistic environments. And The Last of Us was famous for one certain enemy, the infected. When creating the look of the infected, the art team cycled through various iterations. Some early ideas included infected looking like aliens or more zombie-like. The final design was chosen when lead character artist Michael Noland incorporated images of diseases and fungal growth onto a human. The team faced a lot of difficulties in changing the art from 2D to 3D, which would allow the viewing from different angles. The process involved sending completed concept art to the lighting and visual effects artists, who recreated the art within the game's engine. Due to the lack of artificial light sources in the game's world, the team was forced to work with natural light to achieve high-quality lighting. They used light maps. The use of light maps led to various problems, such as discontinuities in the lighting. This was fixed by slightly modifying the textile intensities. When characters were added to scenes, they initially looked out of place. The addition of shadows generally fixed this, however. With a lot of work going into the design of the game environments, NPCs, and enemies, a lot of work also went into what the people would consider a small part of the game, and that small part being the user interface. The user interface design for The Last of Us underwent various different iterations throughout development. User interface designer Alexandra Neonakis originally intended to integrate the weapon upgrade system into the weapon slotting system in order to constantly remind players to upgrade their weapons. Upon further iterations, Alexandria discovered that this integration resulted in a cluttered interface. Ultimately, it was decided that the upgrade system would be integrated into the form of upgrade benches, occasionally found throughout the game's world. This also solved another problem that Alexandria witnessed, in which players would upgrade to the lowest possible option, as opposed to saving parts for higher options. Once it was decided to split the upgrade and slotting system, the initial design was to select the weapons from a circle. This design was eventually considered clunky and slow, and was replaced with the preferred list system. Alexandria had identified that the main problem with the list design was that it forced players to focus on navigating through menus during intense combat. This led to the final design, which allows players to swap and slot weapons in the same menu. To integrate the user interface into the game, Alexandria separated the individual elements and changed their format. User interface programmer Paul Berg provided Alexandria with tools to move the elements using their coordinates. All animated transitions were hard-coded, which led to difficulty in creating smooth transitions. Alexandria Neonakis explained in more detail in an interview with Kotaku. This was tedious and at times incredibly frustrating, but it also meant that we all had to be pretty creative in how things were designed. The game's crafting system was implemented into immediate gameplay in order for players to feel involved. The lead game designer, Jacob Minkoff, would explain, "We needed to make it streamlined and fast enough that you felt like you could take just that moment to be able to craft that thing that's going to mean your survival for the next 30 seconds, or your failure to survive." Another somewhat overlooked but equally loved aspect of the game that needed a lot of work was the game's opening credits. The game's opening credits was directed by Kevin Jolson and designed by Henry Hobson. Original concept development for the opening sequence began in late January of 2013, and a full production began in March of 2013. Though the team initially intended for the game to omit opening credits, they were later added to bridge the gap between the game's prologue and the following scene, a cut that was previously deemed too sudden without the opening credits. San Diego Studio produced the opening credits, using time-lapse photography to record the growth of fungus over multiple days. Only the spores at the end of the credits are computer-generated. The sequence was inspired by Planet Earth, which featured similar concepts. And while the Last of Us team did research on making this game look beautiful, realistic, and horrifying at the same time, they also began working on making the AI as realistic as possible. To do this, the team had to create new engines to satisfy their needs for the gameplay. The artificial intelligence was created to coordinate with the players on an intimate level, as opposed to the action elements from their previous projects. The addition of Ellie as AI was also a major contributor to the engine. The team initially added a feature in which Ellie remains close to Joel, in order to avoid being conceived as a burden. Programmer Max Dykoff stated that, when working on Ellie as AI, he tried to imagine her experiences throughout the game's events, and attempt to achieve realism. as Max put it in this game developers conference in 2014. The first step was to treat the character as a person. To me, Ellie is my second child, and everything I did about her. I was thinking about what she was going through as a character, and a human being as well. I tried to think what her relationship with Joel and the enemies would be, and if I was a person in this world, what would I be doing? He continued, if she was just staying close to you, she's just going to be an escort quest. If she does stuff, you're going to care about her even more. Ellie is, in my opinion, the star of The Last of Us. She's not world-weary like Joel, the protagonist. She's seeing everything outside of the city for her own for the first time, like the player is. She's afraid of scary things, much like we the players are too. We see violence and she's disgusted by it. To this end, she's a very important character. She is, to me, the real character in the game you should be thinking about. Continuing on with AI, the enemy AI was considered one of the most important features of the game. The enemy AI was developed to make random choices. They studied their surroundings, finding tactics to attack the player. This uniqueness to the gameplay was a factor into the attempt at making players feel emotions towards the enemies. The team found great difficulty in developing the gameplay for The Last of Us, as they felt every mechanic required thorough analysis. As Druckmann put it in an IB Times interview, you feel a lot of pressure to add things to make it more fun, and it gets super difficult to keep those things out sometimes. The AI in this game was so aware of their surroundings that the weapons that players have equipped changed the behavior of the human NPCs. In addition, the stealth system was intentionally developed to offer a sense of desperation to make players feel the same. Another feature that was added that I completely forgot about was the game's online multiplayer mode, which featured 3 game types: Supply Raid, Survivors, and Interrogation. In Supply Raid, it is normally 4v4, and your only objective is to kill the opposing teammates until they're all gone. Survivors is the same concept, except the match is divided into rounds in which all 4 players must be killed, and no one respawns until the next round. Survivors offers a better chance to change the tide of the battle, and any team can win regardless of how bad they're losing. Interrogation is completely different from both. It's still 4-on-4, but instead of just killing, you have to interrogate the opponents to find out info that reveals their lockbox. This mode requires a lot of strategy to win, but can be good for beginners who desire to improve their skills. There are only 3 game types because the team opted to limit the number of game types as opposed to creating an abundance of them in order to create a deeper game experience. The multiplayer mode was inspired by the combat encounters of the single player campaign. The team aimed to recreate the slow pace of the encounters and maintain a similar crafting system. This was achieved by making weapons lethal and placing crafting items in strategic locations across the map, which was intended to result in stealthy gameplay and careful selection of ambushes. It also emphasized the stealth and teamwork elements of the mode. Lead multiplayer designer Aaron Daly felt that the slower pace was difficult to achieve in a multiplayer environment, stating that in most multiplayer shooters, players sprint around at high speeds and spray bullets into anything that moves. In addition to that, the multiplayer was designed to support different playstyles. While some players preferred to act as a sniper, other players opt to perform as support. Adding a revive system, when players take a significant amount of damage, they slowly crawl around while bleeding to death, creating a large consequence to death. Losing team members is intended to be a significant loss to players. When designing the multiplayer, the team wanted players to have very little information regarding the location of the threats, while still giving a minor indication of the locations. Daly attributed this to the importance of threat detection and a competitive experience, particularly when the danger is high. And while there are plenty of features added to the game, there were also multiple features omitted from the game that the team considered typical of most video games, such as boss fights. A traditional cover system was excluded from the game as well, as the team wanted players to constantly move around. The team also attempted to cause players to feel as though they are lacking, particularly in supplies that they collect. Straley will explain the motivation for this, as he put it, "You're not building yourself into a tank." This also motivated many of the design decisions for the gameplay, such as the weightlessness of the animations and the melee combat mechanics. To further add to the realism, the team developed the game's combat mechanic in a way that forces players to spend more time planning. They also want players to be forced to retreat from combat after alerting the infected, despite their belief that retreating is the anti-video game play mechanic. The combat mechanic was developed to feel intense, intentionally moving the camera closer to the players, in order for them to feel every strike. The team felt that the game forces players to make difficult choices in terms of combat, stealth, and resource management, allowing them to understand the decisions made by the character. And while it may have been tempting for the team to look back on the success of their Uncharted franchise for inspiration for The Last of Us, many gameplay elements from Uncharted games were excluded from The Last of Us due to the nature of the latter. The team made Joel more grounded and less nimble than Uncharted's Nathan Drake. The camera angle and melee system were also altered to fit with the team's intention of the game. Some gameplay features were inspired by the game's post-apocalyptic nature. The team also felt that No Country for Old Men inspired them in terms of minimalism, wanting to get more intimate with the gameplay scenarios. The team decided to include various optional paths for players to use. While at one point they felt that the additional content was useless, the team eventually felt that it feels more natural and organic. Continuing on with development, while the team worked on the game's looks and mechanics of gameplay, the team not only wanted to make the story tug at your heart, they also wanted the music to do this as well. Druckmann and Straley had been compiling various musical tracks that they found inspirational. When they were searching for a composer to work on the game's music, they realized that many of the compiled tracks were composed by Gustavo Santaolalla. Straley describes Gustavo's music as organic instrumentation, minimalist, dissonance, and resonance with the sounds. As a result, Sony reached out to Gustavo, who agreed to work on the game's soundtrack. After hearing the game's pitch, Gustavo was excited to work on the game. He previously wanted to work on video games. He always refused work, as many of them did not have a focus on story or characters. Due to Gustavo's stance on composing music, in which he lacks knowledge in reading and writing sheet music, and he preferred to simply record, he began working on The Last of Us early in development. To give Gustavo a point to base his music, Druckmann simply told him about the story and themes, as opposed to giving him specific instructions on composing. Gustavo appreciated this freedom, feeling that it personally assisted in the composing. To compose, Gustavo felt that he needed to go into some more dark places, more textural and not necessarily melodic. To challenge himself, Gustavo used a variety of unique instruments he was unfamiliar with, giving a sense of danger and innocence. For The Last of Us, he used a detuned guitar, producing deep noise. To produce unique tunes, he recorded in various rooms, including a bathroom and kitchen. He also tried to make music to evoke a reaction from the player, as their familiarization with the sound would trigger a previous emotion that they felt. Along with the music, the sound design team began working on the game in early development to make the game sound as real and impactful for the players. Early in development, Druckmann told the sound team to make it subtle and underplay ideas. Audio lead Philip Kovacs was excited to completely create all sounds. No sounds were carried across from previous games. The team looked into ways to create sounds from a naturalistic point of view, and how to introduce minimalism into games. By doing so, they found that it added feelings of tension, loss, and hope, and that the game appeared to be a typical action game without the minimalism approach. They used a high dynamic range, allowing them the opportunity to inform players on tactical information and locations to explore. The game's sound design was created to reflect a more grounded and subtle mood than Uncharted, particularly focusing on the lack of sound. Taking inspiration from No Country for Old Men, the team attempted to do more with less. Kovacs said that the team was trying to tell a story by going for a reductive quality. Straley stated in a Polygon interview that the audio is vital to some scenes in the game. As he put it, "It's more about the psychology of what's happening on the audioscape than what you are seeing. Less is more. It's not about the dialogue and exposition inside of a scene, as sometimes the look in a character's eye. That's the same thing with the audio. Less is more. Strip that away. Then when the sound hits, it's really impactful." The team felt that this decision allowed a more impactful and meaningful effect when sound occurred. The sound team also attempted to portray the game's dark themes through sound. The team felt that it was important to let sounds play for as long as possible in the game, drawing tension. The team used a propagation technique to help players determine the exact locations of enemies, using this as a tactical advantage. This system, created by the team at Naughty Dog, is produced at random in the game's engine. The engine throws out 1500 to 2500 ray casts per frame, though most games avoid this. The game's engine allowed this to work though. The team spent a lot of time recording sounds for the game, namely doors, and rusty metal. Sound designer Neil Yucatel traveled to Rio de Janeiro, discovering locations to record sounds. He recorded chickens, which were actually used in the game as the sound of rats. The team continued to add and change game sounds until the end of development. And while the sound of the world you're exploring is very important, so are the sounds of the game's main enemy, the infected. And there is no enemy more popular than the clickers. To create the sound of the clickers, the third stage of the infected, the team found inspiration from a report on the journalism show 2020 about blind children using clicking noises to communicate. Druckmann went into more detail in an interview with Empire Online. We like the idea of taking this benign sound and attributing it to something really scary. In addition, the team wanted to reflect the creature's feeling of pain and suffering, attempting to balance it with a sense of creepiness. The sound team created the sound of the clicker first, realizing early that it was the most challenging. To create the sound, they hired voice actors to perform their renditions. When voice actress Misty Lee provided her own rendition, a noise that Kovacs described as originating at the back of the throat, Kovacs and senior sound designer Derek Espinillo agreed that it was what they wanted. Kovacs then emulated the sound to feature in the game. And with the enemies looking and sounding both real and terrifying, next up was the realism of the characters you'll be seeing and controlling. To do this, Naughty Dog went above and beyond with technology to get this done. For the game's character sculpting and rigging, the team introduced various new elements that were not used in their previous games. Lead character technical director Jude Sementov found that the creation of the faces was the most challenging in terms of hardware. For the faces, the team used joint-based facial rigs with some blend-shaped correctives. To retain the shape of the face and avoid awkward movements, the faces were rigged with the mouth open and eyes slightly closed. The use of higher mesh density also allowed more volumes and creasing in the shape of the face, creating cleaner silhouettes and shapes and giving enough geometry to sculpt correctives. In an attempt to add subtle features, pupil dilation was added to the characters' models. The team edited the character movements from Uncharted 2, softening some joint alignment. The animation of carpal joints was also added for the game, allowing more dynamic hand shapes. Another subtle addition was the arm mover controls, allowing minor edits on the arms. Though this feature was previously available, it was opened up to the animators for The Last of Us. A muscle system was also added, adding muscle shells that bulge, based on attachment joint distance. The muscle system, written in Maya within a few days, works in real time. To solve an issue in which body movement resulted in awkward movement of clothing, runtime helpers were implemented. A total of 326 joints were used in the full character model, with 98 of these in the face. 85 of these runtime driven, while 241 are locked into animation. And speaking of characters, there were lots of characters, and a lot of voice actors needed for this game. And for the main characters, acclaimed voice actor Troy Baker was hired to play the voice of Joel. And to play Ellie was another acclaimed child actor and voice actor Ashley Johnson. Other voice actors were Hannah Hayes as Sarah, Jeffrey Pierce as Tommy, Annie Wershing as Tess, Robin Atkin Downs as Robert, Merle Dandridge as Marlene, W. Earl Brown as Bill, Brandon Scott as Henry, Najee Jeter as Sam, Ashley Scott as Maria, Ruben Langdon as James, and as mentioned earlier, Nolan North as David. And there were tons of other voice actors who helped provide additional voice acting for lesser known characters, but naming them all here would take a long time. And speaking of the cast of this game, their performance was mostly recorded using motion capture technology. Approximately 85% of the game's animations were recorded using motion capture, with the remaining audio elements recorded later in a studio. Gordon Hunt, who had worked on the Uncharted games, was originally employed as the motion capture director. This would change, however, as the team realized the game required a different tone, so they began looking for a new director. As Druckmann was researching the facets of the directorial position and preparing for interviews, he realized that he could take the position himself, and was approved to do so. And while the team quickly felt Johnson was a great fit for the role of Ellie, they spent more time selecting the actor for Joel, as chemistry between the two characters was imperative to the game. After Baker and Johnson played alongside each other, the team realized that the former perfectly fit the role of Joel, despite Baker's young age. Druckmann attributed Baker's voice and movement to the team's choice of casting him. And the casting of Baker and Johnson contributed greatly to the development of the characters. For example, Baker convinced Druckmann that Joel would care for Tess due to his loneliness, and Johnson convinced Druckmann to rewrite the character of Ellie in a stronger and more defensive manner. Some of the dialogue between the duo was even improvised by the actors. Druckmann attributed this to the fact that the script included included an unnecessary number of lines during gameplay selections, and he allowed the actors to choose what they felt was necessary. The characters Joel and Ellie were the basis of the game. The development between the characters was established first, and the game's other concepts followed, creating a unique and admiring character development for the players to experience. From the beginning of the development, the team intended for The Last of Us to feature dual protagonists with strong individual story arcs. During the winter segment of the game, players consume control of Ellie. The developers ensured that this change was kept secretive prior to the game's release, to surprise players. They did the same with Ellie's immunity, as well as with the game's prologue, where players assume the role of Joel's daughter, Sarah. The change of control from Joel to Ellie signifies a change in the role of the protector, echoing Druckmann's previous idea from the student project and his comic. The character interactions were also inspired by the relationship between Nathan Drake and Tenzin in Uncharted 2, which in turn was inspired by the video game Ico. The game's protagonist represents the two eras that are shown in the game. Joel represents the world before the outbreak, having spent most of his time during this period, while Ellie represents the world after the outbreak, as she was born into the post-apocalyptic world. While the former is emotionally damaged due to his loss he has experienced, the latter maintains an optimistic view of life. Having become familiar to the damaged world, spending time with each other saw these qualities overlapping, with Joel becoming more lively and caring, and Ellie learning more survival skills. Druckmann would go into more detail about this in a GamesBeat interview. We knew we wanted this arc where we started with someone whose life had been horrible for the past 20 years. He's pretty much dead. He's a very different person from the father you saw in the beginning of the story. He has very little humanity left in him. The more time he spent with Ellie, she would pull these aspects back out of him. The reverse of that, for Ellie, would be a coming-of-age story. The more time she spends with the survivor, the more she takes on those qualities herself. All this worked towards a cinematic moment where the roles would flip, both in story and in gameplay. The 14-year-old girl becomes a hero. She's the one saving him and essentially bringing him back to life. That was our earliest intention for those characters and their arcs. And while Joel was always meant to be a deep and interesting character, Druckmann initially wrote the character of Joel using the inspiration from Josh Brolin's portrayal of Llewellyn Moss in No Country for Old Men, which he saw as very quiet, very cool under pressure. However, Joel's actor, Troy Baker, had a different interpretation of Joel, as he viewed him as a more emotional person, which would lead to Joel evolving his personality in a different way. Ultimately, the narrative became an exploration of how willing a father is to save a child. Initially, Joel is willing to sacrifice himself, before evolving where he is willing to sacrifice his friends, until finally feeling he would be willing to sacrifice all of humanity in order to save Ellie. Druckmann felt players, specifically parents, would be able to relate to Joel's character and his bonding with Ellie. Baker believed that Joel discovers morality through the game's narrative, working out the differences between loss and sacrifice, and his true personality begins to show. When auditioning for the role, Baker read a phrase on the character sheet that stated Joel had few moral lines left to cross, which became the anchor point to the character for him. Baker found great difficulty in filming the game's prologue, which features scenes with Joel and his daughter Sarah. Upon later viewing of the first day of footage from the scene, Druckmann felt that it could still be improved. When filming the scene again, Druckmann explained to Baker how to perform it, and felt that it was the best take upon doing so. Though Baker initially found it too mechanical, he retroactively realized that he had been previously trying to impress audiences by his acting, and that was not what the scene needed. Now moving from Joel to Ellie, with Johnson portraying Ellie, Johnson faced challenges in performing scenes that made her feel uncomfortable, as she would explain in a Telegraph UK interview. There were some days when we would shoot things that even at my age made me feel a little uncomfortable. Johnson felt that video games rarely featured strong female characters such as Ellie, and expressed her excitement to portray the role for this reason. One question about the inspiration for Ellie as a gameplay feature, Druckmann recalled when he and Strehler were brainwashing ideas for Uncharted 2 Among Thieves, and create a mute character who would summon the player to follow them, creating a beautiful relationship through gameplay alone. Though this concept was never included in the final game, the idea was raised when the team was discussing a new project, ultimately inspiring Ellie. Druckmann also felt inspired by the wars that took place in Syria and Afghanistan when creating Ellie. He felt the conflict was a familiarity to the children in those countries, which is similar to Ellie's view. Another change that was made to Ellie during production was her appearance, as there were some comparisons to the actor Elliot Page. Because of this, Ellie's appearance was redesigned to better reflect Johnson's personality and make her look younger. Now moving on to another character that you encounter along the story, the character Tess. As mentioned previously, she was originally intended to be featured as the main antagonist in The Last of Us, pursuing Joel for a year before the final confrontation, in which she is killed by Ellie. However, the team found it difficult to believe that Tess would dispute with Joel to pursue him for a year. This was solved by significantly adjusting her story. Actress Annie Wersching was impressed by the script and Druckmann's ability to write a unique female character. She went into more detail in this VG 24/7 interview, saying, "I would have to say, and this was also my first audition for a video game, that I was pleasantly surprised at the level of script, because I didn't really know what I was going to be getting into. For all I knew, Tess could have been your stereotypical cliche woman. She definitely is not, and just the way the characters talk to each other, the way it was written was just all very interesting and real. I was pleasantly surprised by all of that, and when I auditioned, I did so with Troy Baker as Joel, who was there with me. It just felt right and good, so I was surprised by that as I wasn't sure what to expect." Another character we should discuss, who made their mark even for being in the story for such a brief period, was Bill. Druckmann initially left the sexuality of Bill vague in the script, but was inspired at the script's read-through to alter a few lines to further reflect Bill's sexuality. To make Bill interesting, Druckmann explored the concept of contradictory statements. While Bill states that becoming attached to people will lower their chance of survival, it is revealed that he had a partner that he really cared for. And as mentioned before, veteran voice actor Nolan North was chosen to play the role of David in the game. To portray the character, North approached his personality from multiple perspectives. Viewing David as a survivor, North empathized with David, stating that most of David's actions were understandable when considering the apocalyptic situation. He felt David was initially attempting to protect Ellie, who was viewed as a glimmer of hope. The team felt the post-apocalyptic world and the survival horror genre gave them the opportunity to better develop the characters, taking inspiration from their work on the Uncharted games. The team used their knowledge of paralleling characters with the conflict in both gameplay and stories when developing The Last of Us. They also took inspiration from the books The Road and The City of Thieves, and as mentioned before, the film No Country for Old Men, noting that they all include memorable characters and using this as a point of inspiration. As Bruce Straley explained in greater detail in the previously mentioned GamesBeat interview, we can make your player feel more of what it's truly like to exist inside a world where every bullet counts, is a conscious choice that's going to make or break your existence. The team also felt that the pressures of the world allowed them to better develop their characters. They felt that the pressures forced the characters to make interesting decisions, allowing better development. And with all that, that was the very long production of The Last of Us, and it had come a long way. From a college project for George A. Romero, to a graphic novel, to a Jack and Daxter reboot, to mushroom zombies that only infect women, to what we have today. A lot has happened over pre-production and production, but the team over at Naughty Dog was creating a truly grim, scary, and beautiful world, with very real and emotional characters, with top-level voice acting for us players to experience and bond with. And with the game being completed, I think it's time to tell you what exactly you will experience when playing The Last of Us. The Last of Us is an action-adventure game played from the third-person perspective. The player traverses a post-apocalyptic environment such as towns, buildings, forests, and sewers to advance the story. The player can use firearms, improvised weapons, hand-to-hand combat, and stealth to defend against hostile humans and the infected, which mentioned previously are zombie-like creatures that are mutated by a strain of the cordyceps fungus. For most of the game, the player takes control of Joel, a man tasked with escorting a young girl, Ellie, across the United States. The player also controls Ellie throughout the game winter segments, and briefly controls Joel's daughter Sarah in the opening sequence. In the combat, the player can use long-range weapons, such as rifles, a shotgun, and a bow, and short-ranged weapons, such as handguns and a short-barreled shotgun. The player is able to scavenge limited-use melee weapons, such as pipes and baseball bats, and throw bottles and bricks to distract, stun, or attack enemies. The player can upgrade weapons at workbenches using collected items. Equipment such as health kits, bullets, shivs, and Molotov cocktails can be found or crafted using collected items. Attributes such as health meters and crafting speed can be upgraded by collecting pills and medicinal plants. Health can be recharged by finding edible items or through the use of health kits. Though the player can attack enemies directly, they can also use stealth to attack undetected or sneak by them. A feature that helps the player in the game is Listen Mode, which allows players to locate enemies through a heightened sense of hearing and spatial awareness, indicated as outlines visible through walls and objects. And the dynamic cover system, the player can crouch behind obstacles to gain tactical advantages during combat. The game features periods without combat, often involving conversations between characters. The player can solve simple puzzles, such as using floating pallets to move Ellie, who is unable to swim, across bodies of water, and using ladders or dumpsters to reach higher areas. Story collectibles, such as notes, maps, and comics, can be scavenged and viewed in the backpack menu. As mentioned previously, the game features an artificial intelligence system by which hostile human enemies react to combat. If enemies discover the player, they may take cover or call for assistance, and can take advantage of the player when they are distracted, out of ammunition, or in a fight. Player companions, such as Ellie, can assist in combat by throwing objects at threats to stun them, announcing the location of unseen enemies, or using a knife and pistol to attack enemies. And that is what you'll experience while playing The Last of Us. And with all that being said, Naughty Dog needed to create hype for their new IP. However, the first announcement of The Last of Us was technically an Easter egg of all things. In December of 2011, prior to the announcement of the game, an Easter egg was found in Uncharted 3, Drake's Deception, referring to the concept of The Last of Us on an in-game newspaper. Naughty Dog retroactively stated that the reference was supposed to be seen after the game's intended reveal at E3 in June of 2011. But when the timing of the reveal itself was pushed to December, the team forgot to remove the reference. Moving on, a few weeks before the game's announcement, a billboard in Times Square teased the game, naming it a PlayStation 3 exclusive you won't believe. Sony officially unveiled the game on December 10th of 2011 at the Spike Video Game Awards. Shortly after the unveiling, Naughty Dog's co-president Evan Wells revealed details about the game, saying, "The Last of Us is a genre-defying experience that blends survival and action elements to tell a character-driven tale about a modern plague decimating mankind. Nature encroaches upon civilization, forcing remaining survivors to kill for food, weapons, and whatever they can find. Joel, a ruthless survivor, and Ellie, a brave young teenage girl who is wise beyond her years, must work together to survive the journey across what remains of the United States." In February of 2013, Naughty Dog announced that The Last of Us would miss its intended release date of May 7th of 2013, delaying it until June 14th of 2013 to allow further polishing. Naughty Dog will explain in a press release, "Instead of cutting corners or compromising our vision, we came to the tough decision that the game deserved a few extra weeks to ensure every detail of The Last of Us was up to Naughty Dog's internal high standards." And while the game was delayed, Naughty Dog still extensively marketed the game through video trailers. The game's first trailer was released alongside the game's full announcement, showing the game's concept, characters, and settings. For this trailer, the team held extended discussions concerning features of the gameplay to include. They initially planned to omit the affected from the first trailer, in order to sharpen the focus on the characters. They ultimately decided to include the infected as they felt that omitting them would arouse anticipation of their final reveal. For the final design of the trailer, the team attempted to incorporate as many gameplay features as possible, including human antagonism, melee implementation, stealth, and character relationships. The first game cinematic was released on May 15th of 2012, depicting a scene in which Joel and Ellie were ambushed by hunters. This was followed by a second trailer titled "The Sky Has Turned Gray," released on May 16th. The trailer revealed a redesign of the character Ellie. Druckmann revealed that this was to make her look more similar to the actress Ashley Johnson. A game cinematic introducing the character Bill was shown during a games panel at San Diego Comic-Con International on July 13th. A third trailer was released during Gamescom in August 14th of 2012, showcasing more of the game's environments and enemies. At the same event, a video was released showcasing the process that cutscenes are developed, from the raw material to the final product. At PAX Prime of 2012, Naughty Dog showcased a video demonstration of the game, displaying mainly gameplay. A story trailer was later shown during the 2012 Spike Video Game Awards on December 7th. A TV trailer of The Last of Us was broadcasted following the third season finale of AMC's The Walking Dead on March 31st of 2013. A trailer for the game's online multiplayer mode was released on June 4th, showcasing the faction's elements to the mode. The final pre-launch trailer was released on June 11th during E3 of 2013. Speaking of E3, there were several functions included in the E3 demonstration that were ultimately removed or toned down in the final product. In the demo, the player had the ability to speedily move while crouched, disarm enemies, dodge melee attacks, view characters picking up ammunition, and peep around corners to check if the enemies were present. The staff reported on their Reddit page such features were ultimately removed because of time constraints during production or because some features were overpowered in the game. Notably, the ability to crouch sprint, because the player remained silent despite how fast they can move. Back to the marketing of the game. The demo of The Last of Us was included with all copies of God of War Ascension and was available from May 31st, 2013 till the game's launch. To encourage pre-order sales, the post-pandemic edition included a unique case packaging, a statue of Joel and Ellie, and unlock codes for additional content in the single-player and multiplayer modes. The Joel edition and Ellie edition include similar content, but contain some features that are often differentiated by the characters. Another form of advertisement was a comic book series, which acted as a prequel to the game. The 4-issue comic book miniseries was titled The Last of Us: American Dreams, and was published by Dark Horse Comics. The comic was written by Druckmann and illustrated by Faith Erin Hicks. The comics chronicled the journey of a younger Ellie and another young survivor, Riley. Dark Horse Comics initially approached Neil Druckmann, who was at the time working on The Last of Us, to produce a tie-in comic book series for the game. Druckmann was initially wary of the idea, but eventually agreed when he realized Dark Horse didn't want to do something tangential, with the opportunity of expanding their characters and universe beyond the game. Work on the comic book began during the game's development, which allowed the stories of the two projects to integrate and influence each other. Druckmann requested webcomic artist Faith Erin Hicks as a collaborator on the project, after reading her comic Friends with Boys, and appreciating how personal it felt. He also felt that Hicks could capture the gritty feel of the game. Hicks then sent some concept art to Dark Horse as a pitch for the job. They accepted, and she officially became involved with the project. Hicks was drawn to the project after reading about the character of Ellie in the game's script. She considered Ellie as an unusual character to include in a survival horror game, calling her a tough teenage girl who wasn't sexualized, and who seemed very much the equal of her male counterparts. Hicks was given access to various gameplay sequences and the game's script during development to allow her to better understand the story. She was also given videos of the actors performing on set, which was helpful when illustrating the characters. She went on to explain, "I get a look at these characters and I see them interacting as human beings, not just concept art." The first issue was published on April 3rd of 2013, and a reprint became available on May 29th, 2013. The second issue was published on the same day. These were both published months before the release of the game. The later issue would be released around the same time of the game's release, as the third issue was released on June 26th, and the fourth was released on July 31st. All 4 issues were republished as a single package on October 30th of 2013. And that is everything I could find that Naughty Dog did to advertise their new IP. And that is really everything. The pre-production, the creation, the production, the gameplay, the advertising of Naughty Dog's new gaming IP, set up to be released on the PlayStation 3 in the summer of 2013. The talented team at Naughty Dog put in a lot of work into this game, along with help from other talented people, such as musicians and voice actors, for example. So, the stage was set for this game. All there was left to do was to release it to the public. So how did it do? Was all of this time, money, and effort worth it? Did Naughty Dog get another gem within their gaming catalog? If you're a fan of The Last of Us, you'll already know the answer to this. The Last of Us was released worldwide on June 14th of 2013, and upon release, The Last of Us received universal acclaim. According to review aggregator Metacritic, based on 97 reviews, it received a 95 out of 100, making it the 5th highest rated PlayStation 3 game on Metacritic. Reviewers praised the character development, story, and subtext, atmosphere, refreshing combat, visual and sound designs, and depiction of female and LGBT characters. The Last of Us is considered one of the most significant 7th generation video games, and has been included among the greatest video games of all time. The Last of Us captured love and praise from all corners of the world. Its ability to tell a compelling story, with all the amazing visuals, sound, character development, acting, etc. Fans and critics alike were in awe at this new game from Naughty Dog. Personally, I remember picking up the game at launch and playing it for 6 hours straight, only stopping because I had to go to work that day. I was mesmerized by everything the game had to offer. There's a reason why The Last of Us is the only game I've ever pre-ordered. I generally don't like the idea of pre-ordering, but something told me that this game would be different, and thankfully, I was right. The Last of Us is truly one of the best games ever created. And thanks to the reviews and the praise from fans, like myself and critics, The Last of Us went on to sell tons of copies. As within 7 days of its release, The Last of Us sold over 1.3 million units, becoming the biggest video game launch of 2013 at the time. 3 weeks after its release, the game sold over 3.4 million units, and was deemed the biggest launch of an original game since 2011's LA Noire, and the fastest selling PlayStation 3 game of 2013 at the time. The game became the best-selling digital release on PlayStation Store for the PlayStation 3. This record was later beaten by Grand Theft Auto 5 though. The Last of Us ultimately became the 10th best-selling game in 2013. In the United Kingdom, the game remained atop the charts for 6 consecutive weeks, matching records set by multi-platform games. This game also topped the charts in the United States, France, Ireland, Italy, the Netherlands, Sweden, Finland, Norway, Denmark, Spain, and Japan. The Last of Us is one of the best-selling PlayStation 3 games, and by August of 2014, the game has sold 8 million copies, and by April of 2018, the game had sold 17 million copies. And according to Nyko Partners and analyst Daniel Ahmad, the game has sold over 20 million units by October of 2019. The Last of Us was a huge success, and it had every reason to be. All the love and effort the team put into this game really showed. And the team and Naughty Dog weren't just awarded with money. The game also won tons of awards, even before the game came out. Prior to its release, The Last of Us received numerous awards for its previews at E3. The game appeared on several year-end lists of the best game of 2013, receiving wins from the 41st Annie Awards, the AV Club, the British Academy Video Games Awards, Canada.com, the Daily Telegraph, Destructoid, the 17th Annual DICE Awards, The Escapist, Games Radar, Game Trailers, the 14th Annual Developers' Choice Awards, Game Revolution, Giant Bomb, Good Game, Hardcore Gamer, IGN, IGN Australia, International Business Times, Kotaku, VG247, and VideoGamer.com. It was also named the best PlayStation game by GameStop, Game Trailers, Hardcore Gamer, and IGN. Naughty Dog won Studio of the Year and Best Developer from the Daily Telegraph, Edge, and the Golden Joystick Awards, Hardcore Gamer, and the 2013 Spike VGX. Along with the game, the actors also received acclaim and accolades as well for their performances, as Baker and Johnson received multiple nominations for awards. Baker won awards from Hardcore Gamer and the 2013 Spike VGX, while Johnson won awards at the British Academy Video Game Awards, DICE Awards, VGX 2013, and from the Daily Telegraph. The game's story also received awards at the British Academy Video Game Awards, the DICE Awards, the Game Developers' Choice Awards, the Golden Joystick Awards, and the Writers Guild of America Awards, and from Game Trailers, Giant Bomb, Hardcore Gamer, and IGN. The sound design and music received awards at the DICE Awards, the Inside Gaming Awards, and from IGN. The game's graphical and artistic design also won awards from Destructoid, the DICE Awards, the Golden Joystick Awards, and IGN. The Last of Us was awarded Outstanding Innovation in Gaming at the DICE Awards, the Best Third-Person Shooter from Game Trailers. The game received the Best New IP from Hardcore Gamer, Best Newcomer at the Golden Joystick Awards, and Best Debut from Giant Bomb. It received Best Overall Sound, Best PlayStation 3 Multiplayer, and Best Action Adventure Game on the PlayStation 3, and overall at IGN's Best of 2013 Awards. It also won Best Action Adventure Game at the British Academy Video Games Awards and The Escapist, as well as Best Action Game from Hardcore Gamer and Adventure Game of the Year at the DICE Awards, and received an honorable mention for Best Technology at the 15th Annual Game Developers' Choice Awards. The game was named among the best best games of the 2010s by The Hollywood Reporter, Mashable, Metacritic, and VG247. The Last of Us had seemed to have done everything right, and because of that, it received the praise, the money, and the awards. The gaming community seemed to be in agreement that The Last of Us would go down as one of the best video games of all time. But that wasn't the end for the fans of the game, as The Last of Us fans would be gifted with DLC. DLC for the game was released following its launch. The game's season pass included access to all DLC, as well as some additional abilities, and the documentary Grounded, the making of Last of Us. The documentary was released online in February of 2014. 2 DLC packs were included with some of the game's special editions and were available upon release. The Sights and Sound pack included the soundtrack, a dynamic theme for the PlayStation 3 home screen, and 2 avatars. The Survival pack featured bonus skins for the players following the completion of the campaign, and in-game money as well as bonus experience points and early access to customizable items for the game's multiplayer. Abandoned Territories pack, released on October 15th of 2013, added 4 new multiplayer maps based on locations in the game's story. Nightmare Bundle, released on November 5th of 2013, added a collection of 10 head items, 9 of which are available to purchase separately. There was also a single-player campaign called The Last of Us Left Behind, which features 2 storylines, one set after the prologue of Last of Us, and one following Ellie and her friend Riley. It was released on February 14th of 2014 as DLC, and on May 12th of 2015 as a standalone expansion pack. A third bundle was released on May 6th of 2014, featuring 5 separate DLCs. Grounded added new difficulty to the main game and Left Behind. Reclaimed Territories map pack added new multiplayer maps. Professional Survival Skill Bundle and Situational Survival Skills Bundle added 8 new multiplayer skills. And Survivalist Weapon Bundle added 4 new weapons. The Grit and Gear Bundle, which added new headgear items, masks, and gestures, were released on August 5th of 2014. A Game of the Year edition containing all downloadable content was released on November 11th of 2014. And even that wasn't the end. Due to all the praise, The Last of Us story would be far from over, with Sony's new console being released in November of that year, the PlayStation 4. Naughty Dog would make a pretty smart decision, as The Last of Us would be remastered for the PlayStation 4. In March of 2014, information concerning the release of The Last of Us on the PlayStation 4 was leaked. This followed by the appearance of the game, titled The Last of Us Remastered, on the PlayStation Store on April 9th of 2014. Naughty Dog announced the game on the same day. This enhanced version of the game featured an increased draw distance, character models of higher resolution, improved lighting and shadows, and an upgraded combat mechanic. It runs a native 1080p resolution at 60 frames per second, with the option to lock the game at 30 frames per second. At E3 of 2014, Sony announced that the game would be released on July 29th of 2014. Some of the downloadable content from The Last of Us is bundled with the remaster, including Left Behind and some multiplayer maps, while others require a separate purchase. In Remastered, character textures were increased by a factor of 4, shadows were doubled, and a new lighting process was implemented. The motion blur when turning the camera, used to hide slower loading textures, was reduced, and the game's environments looked crisper. In addition, new settings were introduced to allow players to customize the game's audio channels, and the loading times were reduced, due to the game streaming from a hard drive as opposed to a disc. One of the biggest developmental challenges was fitting all the content on one Blu-ray disc. The changing of the in-game textures and the inclusion of the Left Behind DLC were the cause for this difficulty. According to lead developer Christian Gerling, Remastered looked broken up until a week before shipping. Development on the remaster began shortly following the release of The Last of Us in June of 2013. Though initially under light development, the team began working harder on the remaster when they saw demand for it. Work on the game's code did not begin until a larger team was introduced to Remastered in February of 2014. As development on the original game ended, the programmers expected that the game would be ported to the PlayStation 4, but planning and preparation did not begin until Last of Us had launched on the PlayStation 3. The team aimed at creating a true remaster, maintaining the same core experience, and not changing any large story or gameplay elements. For the game's frame rate, the team was initially split, with some preferring 30 frames per second rather than 60. When the game was running at the latter, the whole team became convinced. The team that worked on the remaster was significantly smaller than the team for The Last of Us. In particular, the team did not include any designers, which led to various design issues remaining from the original game. Druckmann Druckmann attributed this to the fact that the remastered was development as a recreation of the original, altering only technical and graphical aspects. And with that, The Last of Us Remastered was released on July 29th of 2014. And just like the original on the PlayStation 3, The Last of Us Remastered received universal acclaim. According to Metacritic, based off 69 critic reviews, it received a 95 out of 100. It is also the third highest rated PlayStation 4 game on Metacritic, behind Grand Theft Auto 4 and Red Dead Redemption 2. The game overall received positive reactions from both fans and critics alike. And while this was pretty much just a prettier copy of the original on the PlayStation 3, it is still the best version to own, with the better graphics, frame rate, and technical fixes, along with all the included DLC. Any fan of the original on the PS3 should get rid of the PS3 copy and just purchase the remaster. I should also point out that the remaster sales did also contribute to the 20 million total sales from The Last of Us. Regardless of that, The Last of Us and The Last of Us Remastered were both critical and financial hits, with many claiming that The Last of Us is one of the best games of all time. Naughty Dog had yet again upped the playing field when it came to making games, and with how story-driven and cinematic The Last of Us was, it's no wonder that a movie was in the works. Yeah, it may surprise you that The Last of Us movie was almost created, as on March 6 of 2014, Sony announced that Screen Gems would distribute the film adaptation of The Last of Us, written by Neil Druckmann and produced by Sam Raimi. By January of 2015, Druckmann had written the script's second draft, and performed a read-through with some actors. Very little work occurred following this, as Druckmann stated in April of 2016 that the film had entered development hell. In November 2016, Raimi stated that the film was at a standstill after Sony had a disagreement with Druckmann. Druckmann stated in a 2021 interview that the film fell apart as there was too much studio focus on making big action set pieces, a concept that he felt did not work with the nature of The Last of Us, which he felt was better approached as a smaller indie film. Actress Macy Williams of Game of Thrones fame expressed enthusiasm in playing as Ellie, and was in talks with both Druckmann and Raimi to take on the role. Along with that film, in January of 2020, images surfaced of an animated short film adaptation of The Last of Us by production agency Oddfellows. The 20-minute film was intended to serve as a strong bridge between the game and its sequel, and would reinterpret each of the chapters of the game with a unique visual treatment. But this was ultimately cancelled by Sony. And that is pretty much the story of The Last of Us, Part 1. As any fan of the series knows, this wouldn't be the end of The Last of Us. A game this monumental and successful would not rest with one standalone game, some DLC, a comic book, and a cancelled movie. Oh no, the team at Naughty Dog had created a true gem of a game. So the question now was, what else was there to explore in this crazy fungus-infected world? Story concepts were first conceived in late 2013, following the development and release of The Last of Us. Development began in 2014, soon after the release of Last of Us Remastered. The Last of Us Part 2 was to be a huge undertaking, so huge that approximately 2,169 developers across 14 studios worked on The Last of Us Part 2. By August of 2017, with the release of Uncharted: The Lost Legacy, the entire 350-person team at Naughty Dog had shifted development to Part 2. Neil Druckmann had led development as creative director and writer, reprising his role. And while Druckmann would come back to create the sequel, there would be someone missing from the team, as Bruce Straley, the game director on the original game, left Naughty Dog in 2017. And due to this left Druckmann to be the main force in the creation of the sequel. This was a very big change from the original already, as it could be felt within Naughty Dog. As Druckmann felt the dynamic on Part 2, the first game he co-directed without Straley, was different as a result. But regardless of this, the game's development continued. With the absence of Bruce Straley, Anthony Newman and Kurt Magno were selected to be co-directors for Part 2. Both were hired during the development of Uncharted 2 Among Thieves. Newman was the melee combat designer for The Last of Us, and Kurt was a game director on Uncharted: The Lost Legacy. Magno and Newman oversaw and approved the gameplay elements, such as level design and mechanics. Co-lead game designer Emilio Amelia Schatz and Richard Cambier were also part of the creative leadership team, continuing their roles from development of Uncharted 4. Other staff members hired to work on Part 2 were Christian Nakata as lead artist, Ashley Swindowski as lead character concept artist, art director was to be Eric Pangalainen, John Sweeney, Darshankumar Joshi, and Waylon Brink would be the game's technical art directors. The visual effects technical director role would go to Raymond Popka. Robert Krekel would be the lead for the game's audio. Lead visual effects artist would be Eben Cook. Eric Baldwin, Eric Drew Bell, Owen Wilson, and Samuel Linane would serve as the game's lead cinematic animators. Almudena Soria and Jeremy Yates would be the game's lead animators. Kevin Wang would be the lead studio technician. Ricky Cambert would be given the title of lead game designer. Matthew Gallant would be the game's lead system designer. The lead technical director would be Wasim Khan. Travis McIntosh and Christian Gerling would be named the game's program directors, and Sandeep Shakar was the game's lead programmer. And this was just a short list of everyone who worked on The Last of Us Part 2. As I said before, over 2,000 individuals worked on this game. Moving on with the development, Druckmann identified that while Naughty Dog was granted the freedom to create any type of game, they were energized when presented with the option to make a sequel to The Last of Us, due to the importance of the characters, despite knowing it would possibly divide some of the fans. The team subtitled the game Part 2 because they viewed it as an extension of the first. Druckmann wanted Part 2 to be as effective as a sequel as The Godfather Part 2 was to The Godfather. Pretty early on, plans for multiplayer were cancelled because resources were shifted to improving the scale of the game. So while the Part 2 would be missing something the original had, the team hoped that the increase in focus on the core of the single-player campaign would make up for it. Naughty Dog stated that The Last of Us Part 2 was the longest game they had made. Druckmann goes into more detail about this in this PlayStation blog post. We began working on this game over 5 years ago. It's hard to describe the immense pressure of following up the first game. We know how much you all love this world and its characters, especially Ellie and Joel. Believe me, we're fans as well. We love them, which is why we spent years crafting a game that we feel will do them justice. Telling a nuanced story that deals with the core question: would you go to exact justice against the people that hurt the ones you love? It's a highly emotional story with complex themes that benefit the world of The Last of Us. What we realized pretty early on is that we're putting together Naughty Dog's most ambitious and longest game in our 35-year history. To tell this kind of story, the game needed to be massive. And as Neil put it, the game's story and characters were loved, so the story needed to be top-notch. However, Druckmann was very busy during the development of Part 2, as he was also busy being the new vice president of Naughty Dog as of 2018. Because of this, he had much less time to write Part 2. To circumvent this, Haley Gross, an American screenwriter and former actress, who is best known for writing 2 2016 episodes for the HBO series Westworld, was approached to collaborate as a writer on the game shortly after she had completed her work on Westworld. She was hired as a writer early into development to help Druckmann outline the story and decipher characters. She felt that she and Druckmann had a very similar taste and interests. When Gross joined the project, Druckmann had a structure for the entire story. Gross felt that her perspective on characters and trauma added to the narrative. When crafting the story further, Druckmann and Gross created an outline and presented it to the studio to stress test it. They then worked on a non-chronological order with animators, layout designers, and other departments to develop ideas. Each section of the game was mapped on a wall using note cards. A section was scrapped if it did not contribute to the overall narrative, or was just cool for the sake of being cool. Druckmann found that the additional voice of Gross led to more believable characters, particularly regarding romance and comedy. When she assumed more responsibilities about 2 years into development, Gross was given the title of narrative lead. Josh Shearer and Ryan James contributed to additional in-game dialogue, with Shearer also writing the descriptions of the collectible cards. The story for Part 2 developed slowly compared to the first game. Druckmann believed this time working on Uncharted 4 for 2 years allowed the story of Part 2 to slowly develop. The team experimented with different plot structures and considered scrapping the game entirely until they settled on an idea that mirrored the first game. Druckmann identified that The Last of Us is about the extreme measures one would take for love, whereas Part 2 is more about how far one would go to bring justice for those they love. He initially stated that while the first game focuses on love, Part 2 centers on hate. He later rephrased that both games are about love, analyzing the best and worst it can offer. He felt the town of Jackson represented the best, as its population attempted to live morally in a world representing the real one, while the war between the Washington Liberation Front and the Seraph fights demonstrate the worst, despite some glimpse of hope within the lives of the former. Druckmann predicted that some players would dislike the game's story, but said that he would prefer passionate hate over apathy. He found that some players considered the characters of the first game to be sacred, and wanted to ensure that that was not the case with the sequel. The game's theme of revenge and retribution were inspired by Druckmann's own experience growing up in the West Bank, where violence was a frequent topic. He specifically recalled watching footage of the 2000 Ramallah lynching, and how after hearing the cheering of crowds, his mind immediately turned to violent thoughts of revenge against them. He goes into more detail in this GQ article. I don't want to go into specifics about it, but I saw a video of a lynching when I was much younger. It was like an actual, a news thing. And then feeling intense hatred for the people that committed the lynching and thinking oh man, if I could hurt these people in some horrible ways, then I could. Druckmann would later admit to feeling gross and guilty for having these thoughts. He wanted the player to feel a thirst for revenge before making them realize the reality of their actions. Once he had settled on the basic concepts, the remainder of the narrative outline was complete within weeks. He noted that some members of the team felt reluctant about the game's cynicism, but ultimately he preferred a divisive story rather than a mundane one. He found that stories showing the cost of revenge were more nuanced, and wanted to use the interactivity of the medium to push those feelings to players. He found that people often want to bring someone to justice after witnessing a horrible act, but are unable to do so due to laws and society. In this game's world, however, where the societal structure no longer exists, he saw an opportunity to explore this concept. When researching for the game, he watched the documentary Paradise Lost: The Child Murders at Robin Hood Hills, and its sequel, Revelations and Purgatory, and found it particularly interesting when parents would make comments in interviews about wanting to hurt or kill the West Memphis Three over the murder allegations. He felt that these comments were the preservation of love, wanting to commit a heinous act to bring justice for those they love. He also referred to Dave Grossman's 1996 book on killing, which discusses the desensitization of violence for soldiers. Druckmann noted that the game's other themes included tribalism, trauma, and the pursuit of justice. He felt humans often dehumanize those they oppose in order to justify their own actions in the chase for justice. He found this particularly relevant in modern politics and online discourse, and wanted to explore it within the game without being overly preachy. Gross added that one man's justice is another man's revenge, and wanted the story to show different perspectives and consequences. Druckmann felt that depictions of violent acts was necessary in a story that deals with the cycle of violence, but welcomed members of the team to work on other elements of the game if anything made them uncomfortable. Co-art director John Sweeney pushed for realism in the violence, particularly with the minimizing it instead of embellishing. The game underwent several changes throughout production. Initial pre-production concepts included Ellie discovering information about other immune people. Later in development, the game had 5 days in Seattle instead of 3, including an additional side story wherein Ellie traveled to Seraphite Island, which was intended to humanize the Seraphite characters more. An earlier version of the farm sequence featured a playable sequence of Ellie hunting a boar. Gameplay, art, and performance was completed, but the sequence was cut for pacing purposes and is instead referenced in Ellie's journal. In an art draft, Joel had a girlfriend named Esther, who was originally mentioned as a part of a live performance of some scenes from the first games called The Last of Us One Night Live. In the drafts, Esther lived in a town about 2 hours away from Jackson. In an early version of the flashbacks, Ellie and Joel traveled to Esther and found that she has been bitten. Her death triggered a conversation between Ellie and Joel about a cure. The character was later scrapped as the writers felt she was established too quickly and was more relevant to Joel's arc than Ellie's. A love letter from Esther remained in the game for some time afterwards, but was eventually cut from the final game. Druckmann identified that the first game's pacing was like a film, but he wanted Part 2 to be reflective of a novel, with several quiet moments. Some of the game's dialogue was inspired by British dark comedy series The End of the F***ing World. The notes scattered around the world were developed out of discussions with the team. As a level was built, the team would discuss the stories behind the particular objects in the environment. The team decided to use Seattle as the game's primary location, as its hilly nature and varied weather led to more interesting gameplay scenarios. Artists at Naughty Dog traveled to Seattle to analyze the architecture, vegetation, materials, topography, and lighting, and to capture photorealistic textures. The team chose to experiment with larger open-world environments in Part 2, as they had previously done with Uncharted 4. Druckmann wanted to open the world of Seattle to contribute to Ellie's feeling lost and being frustrated. Druckmann would go into more detail about this in a Game Informer interview, saying, "When you first reach Seattle, we want Ellie to feel a little frustrated, a little lost. We do that by, based on stuff we did in Uncharted 4 and Lost Legacy, that let us play with much bigger level size than we had in the past. We create a really large space. We put you in downtown Seattle. You don't know where to go. The character doesn't know where to go. We want you to feel lost and start moving around." Again, authenticity is what's going to help immerse you. If you're moving through a space that doesn't look good, that doesn't look believable, it's going to pull you out of your experience. A little fun fact about something cut from the story as well: the final chapter of the game originally took place in Mexico, before being moved to Santa Barbara, California. And thankfully for the sake of the story, Ashley Johnson and Troy Baker reprised their roles as Ellie and Joel. Druckmann pitched the narrative to Johnson at a restaurant during early development of The Last of Us: Left Behind, and to Baker after the 10th British Academy Games Award. Druckmann recalled that Johnson approval was the first feeling of validation for the narrative. The actors' performances were recorded at a studio in Playa Vista, Los Angeles, using performance capture, recording motion, and voice simultaneously. The actors wore motion capture suits and head-mounted cameras to track facial muscles and eye movements. Recording ran from 2017 to April of 2019. The actors were allowed to improvise or suggest ideas while performing. Druckmann said that he would do 20 to 30 takes if need be. Gross noted that the goal of the writers was to create the most multifaceted characters you've seen in video games. She particularly wanted to explore the multifaceted behavior of Ellie, showing her power as well as her insecurities. Gross wanted the story to show that there are no heroes or villains, as she explained in more detail in this Polygon interview. What we really care about and what we really want to elucidate in the game is that there are no heroes or villains. There is no black or white. So even as Ellie is going through Seattle and she sees these enemies, they're much more complicated than her superficial interactions with them would necessarily elucidate. Druckmann found that all three playable characters, Joel in the first game and Ellie and Abby in Part 2, mirror each other as they are all suffering with overcoming trauma and quieting their demons. Druckmann recalled the team excitement to explore Ellie's character further as a protagonist, particularly developing the loss of her innocence, comparing it to the feeling of the writers of Breaking Bad when given the opportunity to explore Walter White. The team discussed creating a sequel without Ellie and Joel, but felt they were less interesting. For her portrayal as the primary playable character, Johnson took lessons she learned working with Baker on the first game. Johnson considered her own experience with anxiety and researched the effects of post-traumatic stress disorder with Druckmann. Lead character artist Ashley Swindowski designed Ellie's eyes to demonstrate a somberness not present in the first game, which used wider eyes to reflect her childlike nature. Ellie's tattoo of a moth was designed by California-based artist Natalie Hall after the team struggled to settle on a design. Hall drew the tattoo on developer's arm so the team could visualize it. When Swindowski added the moth design to Ellie's guitar, the team created a connection between it and the tattoo. Druckmann felt that Moth's obsession with light mirrored Ellie's obsession throughout the game, as well as giving her a reminder of Joel. Ellie's journal was a late addition to development, intended to allow further insight on her mindset. The game's flashback sequences of Ellie and Joel served as a way to contextualize the former's motivation and remind the player the reason behind her journey. The writers ensured that the flashbacks featured some conflict to avoid their relationship remaining idle. The writers felt that avoiding the consequences of Joel's actions at the end of the first game would be a disservice to the themes of Part 2. Druckmann recalled that the flashbacks were all over the place and out of order initially, and that Gross worked on the game to include their simplification. The dance scene between Ellie and Dina was originally the game's opening. Once the writers realized that the placement would force the opening cutscene to be 25 minutes long, they moved it towards the end of the game as a flashback, where they felt that they had a stronger impact. In the final flashback, Ellie and Joel originally hugged until Johnson suggested otherwise. The change of player character from Ellie to Abby was inspired by the change from Joel Joel to Ellie in the first game, though emphasized in Part 2 due to focus on empathy. Druckmann found the players acted differently when forced to play as Ellie in the first game, and wanted to replicate similar changes with Abby in Part 2. Druckmann was also inspired by the character switch of Metal Gear Solid 2 Sons of Liberty, which had been suppressed in the game's marketing. The switch to Abby in the game's first chapter was done to demonstrate her personality and her vulnerabilities, and avoid her portrayal as a typical antagonist. The Rares experimented with interspersing Ellie and Abby's gameplay sections, but ultimately settled on longer segments. Druckmann found that Ellie's attempt for revenge was mirrored by Abby, who already achieved it by avenging her father. Early playtests of the final fight led to confusion regarding Ellie's decision to spare Abby. The editorial team suggested adding a flashback of Joel playing a guitar, which Druckmann felt was an effective balance between explicit and implicit motivation. For more than half of the production, Ellie killed Abby in the game's conclusion, and would return to the farm and be tortured but spared by a relative of somebody Ellie killed. Druckmann felt that this was thematically relevant, but realized that it focused too heavily on the themes rather than the characters. After conversations about Yara and Lev, they found that it felt dishonest and that Ellie still had some goodness. Druckmann wanted players to support both characters in the final fight, and realize how futile all of this is. Gross felt that Ellie's decision to track down Abby was motivated by her desire to overcome her PTSD more than her desire to kill Abby. She goes into more detail about this in an IndieWire interview. Ellie's got survivor's guilt, she's got PTSD, and she's haunted by what she's lost. She's haunted by what Abby took away from her, and also, we come to realize, she's haunted by what happened to her relationship with Joel after he told her the truth, and she was so hurt by it. By piecing those details out, it allows us to be with the internal character who isn't much of a sharer, and it allows us to feel those memories coming back to her as she progresses through the narrative. It's also progressively contextualized what's driving her. At first you think it's just f*** those people, they killed my father figure, but then you realize, how does she feel culpable in this? How much does she feel like she took something away from Joel? In my mind, when she's leaving the farm, it almost isn't about Abby at that point as much as it's about, I literally cannot survive if I do not try to handle what's going on because this PTSD is just getting worse and I'm losing control. I feel like I'm at risk to my own family, and I have to hope there's an answer on the other side because I don't know how to live with this. If I stayed here, it's suicide. It's more a conversation about mental health and surviving than it is justice for Abby or even seeking Joel. It's just like, I don't know how to be a person anymore. Gross, who had suffered from PTSD, considered it her responsibility to accurately depict the subject matter. She wanted players who might have suffered with trauma to understand that they are not alone. The Rares want to deconstruct the perception of violence in Joel and Ellie. While Joel is indifferent and practical, Ellie kills to maintain a culture of honor by attaching violence to her ego. Some of the team considered Ellie's obsession with Abby akin to a drug addiction, and that Dina left as she felt the obsession would never end. And while Druckmann and Gross were creating arcs for two main characters in Part 2, another loved character's arc seemed to have been completed, as Druckmann felt that Joel's character arc was complete after the first game. And because of this, one of the game's most loved characters came to an abrupt end. Joel's death was a core part of the game's narrative structure from early in development. Druckmann considered it one of the most difficult to write, rehearse, and shoot. Though it initially caused some internal resistance, the team felt compelled when more of the narrative was built out. An early version of Joel's death scene had him utter Sarah, his daughter's name, until Baker suggested that he should remain silent. While Sarah's death in the first game intended to invoke sadness, Joel's death aimed to inflict anger. Ellie was originally absent during the scene, and was to be informed by Joel's brother Tommy, but Druckmann felt that witnessing the death through Ellie's perspective emphasized the anger of the player. He wanted to be portrayed as gross, unceremonious, and humiliating, instead of heroic. It was originally more gruesome, but later toned down as the gore was not crucial to the scene. He predicated that it might lead to some negative reactions, but felt it was necessary to tell in the story. He particularly felt that Naughty Dog's notability in the industry gave it the opportunity to take risks that other developers could not do. In an earlier version of the scene, Abby stabbed Joel in the back and twisted the knife to paralyze him. However, as knives are more closely associated with Ellie, the team replaced it with a golf club to demonstrate Abby's blunt force attacks. When auditioning actors for Abby, Druckmann specifically wanted to avoid casting Laura Bailey due to her prolification of roles. He had originally considered Bailey to play Dina. When reviewing her audition tape, however, Druckmann was impressed by how Bailey played into Abby's vulnerability, whereas other actors emphasized her anger. Bailey considered the game important to her personally, as she gave birth to her first son during production. Prior to her pregnancy, Bailey was working out in preparation for her role. She also prepared by researching the people involved in wars and their coping mechanisms. An early iteration of the story had a young Abby witnessing an attack on her group by Joel and Tommy, who were hunters at the time, and unseen events 20 years before the first game. As the story and themes of violence developed, the writers found it more interesting for Abby's father to have been killed by the player in the first game, directly tie into Joel's and the player's actions. Druckmann wanted the players to hate Abby early in the game, but later empathize with her. He avoided writing her as a perfect character, instead prompting empathy through her flaws and redemptive actions. Some of the game's flashback scenes with Abby initially depicted her joining the WLF, although it was an unconscious decision on her behalf, as the leader of the WLF was a fellow member of her former group and acted as a father figure for her. Abby's goal to kill Joel was fueled by her desire to return to a world before her father's death, but she discovers it's impossible. After witnessing Owen's battle for light, she finds her own purpose protecting Yara and Lev, which Druckmann felt mirrored Joel's redemption arc from the first game. Majno felt that Abby was inspired to abandon her alliances after witnessing Lev's rebellious nature. When Ellie holds Abby underwater in the final fight, the actress Bailey actually held her breath while recording. She recalled that Johnson let her go when she saw Bailey's lips turning blue. Bailey felt that, in the game's conclusion, Abby understands Ellie's emotions, having dealt with her own father's death. Gross connected with the actress Shannon Woodward, with whom she had worked with on Westworld. Druckmann, who was a fan of Westworld, spoke with Woodward for several months before offering her an audition to play Dina. Johnson recalled that the team had narrowed the potential cast around 4 actors. After testing with Woodward, Johnson felt that they immediately had chemistry. Woodward was later cast as Dina. Woodward felt that some people deal with trauma through comedy, and she would often improvise jokes while recording. As a narrative function, Dina represented the community of Jackson, and what Ellie stood to lose from her revenge mission. Her presence allowed Ellie moments of light. And on to another important new character for the game. Originally in development, Lev was not transgender. An early pitch was for Yara to be transgender, but Druckmann preferred to keep her a more traditional follower of the Seraphites. Queer and transgender employees of Naughty Dog gave input on the character, and the team consulted with an LGBTQ scholar. When the developers reached out to acting agencies to cast the character, they found out none represented transgender actors. This was thankfully solved, however, as some of the team was a fan of the drama TV show The OA, which starred Ian Alexander, though they were not represented by any agency at the time. Alexander was invited by Druckmann to audition. When exploring the idea of making Lev transgender, the team found it to be an interesting look into the violence that can be found within organized religion. Alexander was attracted to the role as they underwent similar emotions when transitioning, having come from a religious background and also receiving backlash after cutting their hair. They felt that Lev had been forced to grow up due to his surroundings. Despite some hesitation, the team determined that Lev's dead name being used by the Seraphites demonstrated the difference between their transphobia and Abby and Yara's acceptance. The team hired a religious consultant to ensure the Seraphites' response to Lev's transition was accurate without being unintentionally offensive. Druckmann considered Lev among the most important characters as he represented the same innocence that Ellie did in the first game. Along with all those actors I just mentioned, these are also actors that showed up in Part 2. Victoria Grace as Yara, Derek Phillips as Jeffrey, Jeffrey Pierce again as Tommy, Stephen A. Chang as Jesse, Ashley Scott as Maria, Robert Clotworthy as Seth, Patrick Fugit as Owen, Alejandro Ida as Manny, Chelsea Teravez as Nora, Ashley Birch as Mel, Chase Austin as Jordan, Ruben Langdon as Mike, Maggie McDonald as Portable Gamer Girl, Merle Dandridge as Marlene, Emily Swallow as Emily, and Jeffrey Wright as Isaac. Along with all of them, there were many other actors and voice actors who contributed to many roles in The Last of Us Part 2, but that again would take a very long time to name them all. And while the team worked really hard on the story of this new game, the developers also wanted technical aspects of the game to be top-notch, as the developers pushed the technical capabilities of the PlayStation 4 when creating Part 2, adding more enemies and larger environments than the previous game. Druckmann noted that all the drops in detail would ruin the game's authenticity, which required consistent optimization of the technology. The team created a new animation technique called motion mapping for the characters, which allows for more realistic transitions between movement actions. The advancement of the game's artificial intelligence allowed for deeper connections with the characters and the creation of bonds through gameplay. Enemy AI also have more complex understanding of the player's locations at any given time. The additional animations require more significant amount of data and motion capture performances than in previous games. Horses and dogs were also motion captured for movement in the game. The Last of Us Part 2 was originally planned as an open world game with hub worlds in Jackson and in Seattle. The player would initially complete missions in the former as Abby before she revealed her true intentions, and later in the former as Ellie when she tracks down Abby. But the game transferred to a more linear style as it better served the narrative. Ellie's agility prompted the addition of new gameplay features, including puzzles and traverse sections, and more advanced dodging and stealth mechanics. Margino wanted the new gameplay features to immerse the player in the world without feeling gamey. The introduction of the gameplay elements, such as tracking dogs and named enemies, was intended to create an emotional response. The team also emphasized the importance of Ellie's weapons to form a realistic attachment from the player, though Druckmann noted that the narrative's tension was more important than the gameplay realism in some instances, such as the moment of enemies that Ellie kills. The glass breaking mechanic was seen as a big win for the development due to its technical difficulty and versatility for level design. Early prototypes of the game actually include a companion dog for Ellie, who could fit under fences and fetch items. This idea was scrapped pretty early on though. Some scenes in the game, such as Owen and Mel's death from Ellie's perspective, were originally depicted as gameplay, but later converted to non-interactive cutscenes to emphasize their impact. The dance scene between Ellie and Dina was originally interactive and more extensive, featuring sequences where the player could mix drinks, chase children, and interact with a cat. Ellie's ex-girlfriend would be there, but the sequence was eventually cut for narrative purposes. Ellie and Dina's kiss was actually one of the most demanding scenes to animate. It was recorded in two ways, without the face camera helmets so the actors could kiss, and kissing in the air with the helmet so the animators had a reference for the facial movements. Lead cinematic animator Eric Baldwin said that the minute details that had been implemented in the graphics software Autodesk may included dynamic hair strands and cheek fluffiness. In Part 2, Naughty Dog wanted to increase the accessibility options introduced in Uncharted 4 to ensure all players could complete the story. The developers attended conferences and worked with advocates like Brandon Cole and Can I Play That? Media editor Steve Saylor during the process. The game has around 60 accessibility options, including audio clues, visual aids, and customizable controls. The team began planning the features during early production, which game designer Matthew Gallant felt was the reason they added so many. In particular, high contrast mode, customizable controls, and text-to-speech required the most resources. The designers ensured that the game's tone and themes remained consistent with the accessibility options enabled. Schatz found the visual options particularly challenging due to the spectrum of visual impairments. When the developer suggested an accessibility option to censor the violence against dogs, Druckmann refused as it would impact the narrative too heavily. He felt that including an option to censor gore would lessen the discomfort intended by the story. Members of the team worked extra hours to ensure the addition of the accessibility option anyway, despite Druckmann instructing them otherwise. Continuing on, we cannot forget that the visuals and story are affected by the sound and the music of the game. A sound designer at Naughty Dog created a system that tracked the player's character level of exertion and plays matching respiratory audio effects. To create the sound effect of the Shambler, sound designer Bo Anthony Jimenez made a palatal clicking noise into a paddled bucket via the tube, which he recorded with an ultrasonic microphone. He added this atop a slowed down palatal sound to create the Shambler bark. Voice actors Raul Celabalos and Steve Blum contributed to the Shambler sounds, the former to screams and the latter to grunts. The explosion sounds were created by squeezing grapefruits and expanding a life jacket. For additional texture, he filled the bellows with oatmeal and blew it. The audio of the resulting acid cloud was achieved by dripping water on a pilot light and melting ice over a hot pan. There would be familiarity with the music in Part 2, as Gustavo Santaola returned to compose and perform perform the score. He was tasked with creating the emotional, character-based tracks. Gustavo worked on the game for around 2 to 3 years. Instead of scoring directly to the game's material, he created music based on the story pitch by Druckmann, and the two later collaborated to fit the music into the scenes, where it would occasionally require a minor rewrite. He delivered small parts of the music over time, often inspiring Druckmann to write new scenes based on the tracks. With elements of the game still in development, Gustavo worked with the story, characters, and artwork to craft the score, though he felt his work on the first game ensured that he was already familiar with the visual language. He wanted to maintain and extend motifs from the first game, while introducing new elements. Gustavo continued to use the ronroco, his signature instrument used in the first game's main theme, as he felt it enhanced Ellie's qualities through a feminine sound. Part 2's main theme uses a banjo, which Gustavo felt reflected the game's American setting and origin. He was initially hesitant in using it, but the developers encouraged him to do so. The music during Joel's death scene intended to build dread, but feel inevitable, as opposed to the surprise and sadness invoked during Sarah's death in the first game. Druckmann wanted to achieve moments in which the music conveys narrative elements. Of course, Gustavo wasn't the only one working on the music of the game, as Mac Quayle, an American composer for film, television, and video games, best known for his work on the USA Network's Mr. Robot and for FX's American Horror Story, contributed to the game's combat music. He was hired on the project in early 2018. The developers were familiar with his previous work on the television series Mr. Robot. He was largely unfamiliar with gaming. Quayle immediately bought a PlayStation 4 and a copy of The Last of Us to familiarize himself with the series before meeting to discuss the second game. He began writing ideas for the game in May of 2018 and delivered his final music in January of 2020. He found the deadlines much more relaxed compared to film and television projects. The team discussed potential collaborations between Gustavo and Mac, including sharing stems and sessions, though ultimately their collaborations were minimal. They performed a 3-day recording session in the PlayStation offices in October of 2018, where they experimented with different sounds and instruments to create grooves and textures that were later used in the game. Quayle attributed the similarities between their work to the developers really knowing what they wanted. Quayle's music aimed to represent relentless tension of the gameplay sequences, consistently moving the action forward and heightening the suspense and anxiety. The developers wanted to avoid music that sounded too electronic or too organic and natural. Quayle was provided with videos of early gameplay captures for inspiration, instead of composing directly with the scenes. He used Logic Pro for his work, which he used to heavily manipulate the several live acoustic instruments. His favorite instruments on the project were the bass guitar and the cello. For the latter, he brought in a professional cellist. The in-game cover became a significant part of the characters and their development, namely Ellie with her guitar. Druckmann found that Ellie's guitar playing allowed her access to her memories and emotions. When she loses her fingers in the game's conclusion, it serves to sever ties to her memories and relationships. The song Future Days by Pearl Jam acts as the theme between Ellie and Joel throughout the game. The song was previously featured as a part of One Night Live in an unbroadcasted epilogue wherein Joel plays the song to Ellie. According to Druckmann, Sony was doubtful that Naughty Dog would receive permission to use the song, but to their surprise, the band's manager agreed after hearing the story pitch, receiving a PlayStation 4 and a copy of the original game as compensation, and an advanced screening of the trailer. Although the song's album, Lightning Bolt, was released 2 weeks after the onset of the in-game outbreak in September of 2013, Druckmann recalled seeing a live performance of the song several months early in July, and felt that its inclusion was realistic. Sean James was contacted by Sony in mid-2014 for permission to create a cover of his song Through the Valley for an upcoming game. James was unaware of how it would be used until he watched the game's first trailer at the PlayStation Experience in December of 2016. Druckmann had specifically enjoyed the song and felt that it aligned with the game's darkness and emotion. This extra attention caused the song to go viral after the trailer's release, charting atop the Spotify viral charts in the United Kingdom. Naughty Dog also wanted to secure permission to use Take On Me by Aha to use in one of the game's scenes due to Gross's friendship with Lauren Savoy, the wife of Aha's guitarist, Paul Savoy. Druckmann Druckmann found that the song's lyrics addressed the game's theme in a lighthearted manner. He felt that the scene featuring the song being optional made it feel more important to the player, though the team considered making it unmissable instead. Johnson also planned to sing in the game, as she worked with vocal coach Melissa Reese. There was, however, a problem, as the team felt that her singing was too refined, and asked her to consciously sing worse. And while not singing, but still dealing with sounds from people, the whistling of the Seraphites was a long discussed element of the game. Production began in early of 2018 in preparation for an upcoming demonstration. The team originally referenced whistled language such as Esophiria and Sobo Gomurro, but found that they were more sophisticated than necessary. They also worked with professional whistlers, but found the result to be too bird-like. Dialogue supervisor Mage Khalil and UI artist Maria Capel recorded around an hour of sample whistles, which dialogue coordinator Grayson Stone organized into 14 groups, dependent on duration, trill, intensity, and tone. After some iteration, the team decided on 26 categories, each representing lines the Seraphites used to communicate. Actors Stevie Mack and Lisa Marie provided the final whistles in the 3 styles, each in different level of quality. The team wanted the subtitles to represent the nuance of the whistles without giving away their exact meaning, and consulted accessibility specialist Morgan Baker to create them. The team discussed adding additional communication methods, such as knocking on trees or rattling, but it would have required additional animation, art, and sound design work. And while all of that was being worked on, everything seemed to be going smoothly. That was until the team would run into an issue that really everyone had to deal with, an event that affected the whole world. For the final months of development, the team shifted to remote work due to the COVID-19 pandemic, though they were given the option to do so prior to the mandatory stay-at-home order in California. The operations manager department ensured the transition was smooth, as the studio housed technologies such as development kits that were not accessible in in-home setups. Druckmann felt lucky that the development was almost complete by the time the pandemic spread in the United States. Game development ceased by May 4th of 2020, when it was submitted for manufacturing. And while the team at Sony, Naughty Dog, and Druckmann all wanted Part 2 to be as loved and successful as the first, development wasn't as smooth as planned. The development, according to a report by Kotaku's Jason Schreier, included a crunch schedule of 12-hour workdays, owing it to the studio culture. After the game's delay, developers continued under this schedule for additional months. Schreier suggested that development was affected and slowed due to the enormous turnover of employees following the development of Uncharted 4, with few veterans left on the team. Some of the developers working on the game allegedly hoped that the game would fail to prove that the working condition they were under was not viable. Publisher Sony Interactive Entertainment granted the developers an additional 2 weeks of development for bug fixes. Ultimately, Druckmann felt that he failed to find the correct balance for employees on Part 2, and that the studio would receive external assistance for future projects. But the question was now, would these poor working conditions, lack of veterans, and COVID come at the cost of the final product? With the development of the game now ending, with The Last of Us Part 2 getting ready for release, would the game succeed like its critically acclaimed predecessor? Sony and Naughty Dog wanted just that, to have Part 2 be as successful, if not more successful, than Part 1. To do this, they did a lot of promoting for the new game. The game was extensively marketed through the video trailers. The first trailer was released alongside the game's announcement, showcasing the return of Ellie and Joel, and featured a cover of Sean James' Through the Valley, performed by Johnson. The trailer was named the best cinematic of 2016 by Behind the Cinematic. At PlayStation Experience in December of 2016, Game Informer's Andy McNamara moderated a panel with Druckmann, Johnson, and Baker. The second trailer was released in October of 2017 as a part of the Paris Games Week. It revealed Abby, Yara, and Lev. Druckmann stated that the characters are integral to Ellie and Joel's next journey. While the trailer was well received, it drew some criticism for its violence. IGN's Max Scoville felt that the trailer was a little out of touch for introducing characters entirely through violence and without context. Druckmann would actually respond to this, saying, "We're making a game about the cycle of violence, and we're making a statement about violent actions and the impact they have. The idea was for players to feel repulsed by some of the violence that they are committing themselves." At PlayStation Experience in 2017, Hannah Hart moderated a panel with Druckmann, Gross, Johnson, Baker, Bailey, Alexander, and Grace. Johnson and Baker opened the panel with a performance of The Wayfaring Stranger. The game was also featured at Sony's E3 event in June of 2018, revealing Dina and Jesse. The kiss between Ellie and Dina in the presentation was praised for appearing passionate and believable, a feat frequently considered difficult to animate. Critics also praised the improved graphics, enemy artificial intelligence, and combat. Druckmann recalled that the team rehearsed and choreographed the gameplay within the presentation, particularly due to the openness of the level. E3 Coliseum hosted a panel for the game, moderated by IGN's Lucy O'Brien and featuring Druckmann, Newman, Majno, Johnson, and Woodward. Another trailer was featured in Sony's State of the Play presentation in September of 2019, followed by some additional marketing to celebrate Outbreak Week, the week in which the fictional outbreak occurred in the original game, including some hands-on demonstrations for journalists, behind-the-scene videos, and merchandise announcements. In the same week, Naughty Dog also announced the special edition versions of the game. The Digital Deluxe Edition featured a digital soundtrack, art book, and dynamic themes. The Collector's Edition included the same, as well as a steel bookcase, a physical art book, bracelet, and a statue of Ellie. And the Ellie Edition also included a replica of Ellie's backpack and a vinyl record featuring some music from the game. The game's story trailer was released on May 6th. From May 13th to June 3rd, Naughty Dog released a series of videos about the development of Last of Us Part 2, discussing the narrative, gameplay, and the world. The game was featured on its own standalone State of the Play presentation on May 27th, revealing an extended gameplay demonstration. An animated commercial was released on June 3rd, featuring Ellie singing an acoustic cover of True Faith, a song by New Order. The cover is specifically inspired by the version by Lottie Kestner, though she was not credited. This actually created a little bit of a problem, with Kestner actually reaching out to Naughty Dog. Druckmann issued an apology and ensured a proper credit. The final pre-launch trailer was released on June 10th. Druckmann claimed that the Sony marketing department wanted less secrecy surrounding the narrative, but he was unwilling to reveal twists to the player. Naughty Dog replaced and altered characters in the trailers to conceal story events. Druckmann cited the marketing of Metal Gear Solid 2: Sons of Liberty, which concealed its protagonist in the trailers, as an influence. And while Naughty Dog was doing all that they could to hype the game, they also did all they could to not hint at the release date. At E3 of 2018, Druckmann said that Naughty Dog was refusing to announce a release date until the game was very close to release, to avoid disappointing fans. And this first release date was announced during Sony's State of the Play presentation on September 24th of 2019. Naughty Dog revealed that the game would be released on February 21st of 2020. This wouldn't last, however, as a month later, on October 25th, Druckmann announced that the game was delayed to May 29th of 2020 to bring the entire game up to a level of polish we would call Naughty Dog quality. Then on April 2nd of 2020, Sony announced that the game was almost complete but had been indefinitely delayed due to the logistical problems caused by the COVID-19 pandemic. The team used the additional time for further polishing. Then in April, however, the public did get some new information. However, this information was not released by Naughty Dog, as several videos were leaked online, showing cutscenes, gameplays, and significant plot details. Druckmann would go on to tweet that he was heartbroken for fans and for the team, who had devoted years to development. A few days later, Sony stated that it had identified the leakers and that they were not affiliated with Sony or Naughty Dog. According to Schreier, hackers had used a security weakness in a previous Naughty Dog game to penetrate the company's servers. On April 27th, Sony announced a new release date of June 19th of 2020. A performance update for the game was released on May 19th of 2021. The Last of Us Part 2 was now finally ready to release to the public. The development and advertising were done. The sequel to one of the highest rated games was complete. So, what were players in store for? Like the first game, The Last of Us Part 2 is an action-adventure game played in the third-person perspective, featuring elements of survival horror. The player traverses post-apocalyptic environments such as buildings and forests to advance the story. The player can use firearms, improvised weapons, and stealth to defend against hostile humans and the infected. Control intermediately switches between the characters Ellie and Abby. The player also briefly controls Joel in the opening sequence. The nimble nature of the player character characters introduces platforming elements, allowing the players to jump and climb to traverse environments and gain advantages during combat. The player can break glass objects such as windows to access certain areas or obtain supplies, and some areas are navigated by horses or boats. In combat, the player can use long-ranged weapons such as rifles and bows, and short-range weapons such as pistols and revolvers. The player is able to scavenge limited-use melee weapons such as machetes and hammers, and throw bricks and bottles to distract or attack enemies. Collected items can be used to upgrade weapons at workbenches, or craft equipment such as health kits, Molotov cocktails, and makeshift silencers. The player can collect supplements to upgrade skills in the skill tree. Training manuals throughout the environment can unlock additional skill tree branches, allowing upgrades to attributes such as the health meter, crafting speed, and ammunition types. Though the player can attack enemies directly, they can also use stealth to attack undetected or sneak past enemies. Listen mode returns, which again allows players to locate enemies through a heightened sense of hearing and spatial awareness. In the cover system, the player can crouch behind obstacles to gain advantages in combat, and can also crawl in a prone position to evade enemies. All hostile enemies use artificial intelligence. They may take cover or call for assistance and can take advantage when the player is distracted, out of ammunition, or in the middle of a fight. The player may be impaled by an arrow, which will progressively decrease their health meter and disables listen mode until removed when in cover. Player companions such as Dina assist in combat by killing enemies or announcing their location. The game also introduces guard dogs that track the player's scent, which can be visualized in listen mode. And that, my viewers, is the gameplay, the story, and the development of The Last of Us Part 2. That is what players are in store for in the sequel. And with that, that's all there is left to do. Releasing the long-awaited sequel for fans and newcomers to enjoy. The game had been created by a very large staff. Even with the complications during the long development, the game had been completed and been advertised. Every fan of the first game was eager to get their hands on the long-awaited sequel to what is said to be one of the best games ever made. And so, June 19th of 2020 came, and The Last of Us Part 2 was released. So, how did it do? Was The Last of Us Part 2 just as successful, loved, and impactful as its critically acclaimed predecessor? Did it meet the high expectations? Once the game was released to the public, The Last of Us Part 2 received universal acclaim from critics. According to review aggregator Metacritic, it got a 93 out of 100. It was praised for its improved gameplay, graphical improvements, cast performance, characters, audio design, and music, though some critics were divided on its narrative and themes. So just like the first game, the critics saw The Last of Us 2 as another beautifully crafted game from Naughty Dog. However, while the critics loved the game in almost every aspect, not everything was sunshine and rainbows for this new game. The game was subject to review bombing on Metacritic, resulting in a user review score as low as 3.4 out of 10 at its lowest. Reports noticed that review bombing occurred shortly after the game launched, too early for users to feasibly have finished it. Some suggest that the reviews was based on the plot leaks. Many of the negative reviews criticized the characterization and the plot. Some complained of social justice warrior politics, with vitriolic responses to the LGBT characters. Besides the review bombing, some players had some real heartfelt criticisms, as they criticized Joel's death in the opening hours, perceiving a discrepancy between his cautious nature in the first game and his more trustful and protective attitude in Part 2. A number of players considered Joel's brutal and undignified death disrespectful, while some would go on to rebuke that, saying that it's realistic, as most deaths occur at unfortunate times. Some players felt that the marketing, which had altered and replaced characters and trailers to conceal Joel's death and Abby's role, was intentionally deceptive. Druckmann would later respond that Naughty Dog had intended to preserve the game's experience, and not to bamboozle anyone or get their $60. A subset of players criticized Abby. Some players disapproved of her playable character, as they had expected to control Ellie for the majority of the game. Some players even criticized Abby's muscular physique, and theories spread online that she was transgender, and some argued that this perception was a result of the lack of body diversity in games, and that the story showed Abby had the resources to achieve achieve her physique. This criticism of a character in a video game would eventually go too far, however, as this would lead to Laura Bailey, who played Abby, to become the target of online death threats in response to the character. Naughty Dog would release a statement condemning these threats, and Bailey was supported by James Gunn, Ashley Johnson, and Craig Mazin, among many others. Back to the criticisms of Part 2, some members of the transgender community objected to the representation of Lev, a transgender supporting character. Criticism focused on villains using Lev's dead name, that the character was created by cisgender writers, and the use of trans stories as tragedies. Stacey Henley of VG247 responded that Lev's dead name is used sparingly, and that Ian Alexander, a transgender actor, provided the character's voice and motion capture as a defense. And about Part 2, I can personally say this. I enjoyed Part 1 more than I enjoyed Part 2. While I think Part 2 is a better game as it looks and feels better, improvements were made for so many different aspects for Part 2 compared to Part 1. However, the story is where I had personal issues with the game. If you want a more in-depth look of how I feel about Part 2, I would suggest watching these videos from Nakey Jakey and Wendigoon, as I feel like they somewhat represent my feelings on the game pretty well. Plus, they're both just amazing creators. In the end, I do understand and appreciate what Naughty Dog was going for here with the story and the themes. But at the end of the day, I have played and beaten The Last of Us Part 1 multiple times, and I've only ever played and beaten Part 2 once. I don't really have a desire to play it again. Honestly, Part 2 is just a hard game to play through. The story really takes an emotional toll on you. I'm sure that's really the point, but yeah, that's my feelings on the game. It's a game that's just kind of hard to play and beat. But regardless of my own opinion, even with the good reviews from critics, clearly this was different, as both critics and user scores of The Last of Us Part 1 for the PlayStation 3 and the PS4 had pretty much the same positive reviews, while the user score differed greatly from the critic score for The Last of Us Part 2, as the critic score sits at 93 out of 100 and the user score sits at 57 out of 10. And while the user reviews did not reflect the same unanimous love that the first game had, it didn't really matter, as Part 2 was still a really big success. This was made apparent pretty early on, as in its release week, The Last of Us Part 2 sold over 4 million copies worldwide, becoming the fastest selling PlayStation 4 exclusive, beating Spider-Man's 3.3 million and God of War's 3.1 million in the same time period. It had the biggest launch of 2020 for both physical and digital sales. On the PlayStation Store, it was the most downloaded PlayStation 4 game in North America and Europe in June. In July, it was 5th in North America and 10th in Europe. In November, it was 8th in North America and 7th in Europe. And overall for 2020, it ranked 6th in North America and 8th in Europe. In the United States, it was the best-selling game for June of 2020, and became the third best-selling game of the year within 2 weeks, generating the highest first-month sales of the year. In the UK, The Last of Us Part 2 became the fastest-selling physical PlayStation 4 game, outselling previous record holder Uncharted 4 and The Last of Us. It was the nation's 8th best-selling game of the year, with 543,218 copies sold, and the 7th for the physical sales. By June of 2022, the game had sold over 10 million copies worldwide. Along with the massive sales, even with some of the criticism, the game was still honored with many accolades. The Last of Us Part 2 holds the record for most Game of the Year awards, surpassing the previous record holder, The Witcher 3. It was awarded from outlets and shows such as Den of Geek, Digital Trends, Electronic Gaming Monthly, Empire, Entertainment Weekly, Game Informer, PlayStation Blog, Push Square, and the Titanium Awards. It was named runner-up by several other publications as well. The Last of Us Part 2 was ranked among the best games of its generation by Game Informer, Game Radar, and IGN. At the 38th Golden Joystick Awards in November of 2020, it won all 6 awards for which it was nominated: Ultimate Game of the Year, Best Studio, Best Storytelling, Best Visual Design, PlayStation Game of the Year, and Studio of the Year for Naughty Dog. It led the nominees for the Game Awards of 2020 with 11 nominations, of which it won 7, the most in the show's history, which was Game of the Year, Best Game Direction, Best Narrative, Best Audio Design, Innovation and Accessibility, Best Action Adventure, and Best Performance for Bailey. The Last of Us Part 2 was nominated for 24 awards at the National Academy of Video Game Trade Reviewers Awards, the most in the show's history. It won 8, including Outstanding Direction in Game Cinema, Franchise Adventure Game, Lead Performance, and Drama for Johnson and Bailey, and supporting performance in a drama for Baker. It was nominated for 11 awards at the 17th British Academy of Games Award, the most in the show's history, winning for animation, the publicly voted EE Game of the Year award, and performer in a leading role for Bailey. It led the nominees at the 24th Annual DICE Awards with 11 nominations, of which it won 2, Outstanding Achievement in Animation and Outstanding Achievement in Story. It also led the 19th Annual Game Audio Network Guild Awards with 15 nominations and 8 wins, and the 21st Game Developers Choice Awards with 6 nominations, of which it won 1. It received the most nominations at the inaugural Global Industry Game Awards with 13, in which it won 3, which was 3D animation, cinematography, and story. And with that is the full story of The Last of Us Part 2. Naughty Dog had created one of the best video games of all time, and they decided to continue it with a Part 2. However, this sequel ran into many issues during development, whether it was from crunch work, COVID, or hiring workers from other companies. Along with that, the story, the themes, the actors, and the characters of the game saw plenty of criticism. Some justified, some not so much. But regardless of all that, Part 2 still thrived, with high sales and plenty of awards. And this is all on the video game front that has happened in regards to the story of The Last of Us. But even while there is no new official continuation, such as a Part 3 in the works at the moment, with just rumors floating around, this doesn't mean it's the end of the story. For starters, there is a new game in the works. Well, new is stretching it, as this new game is a remake of the first game. The existence of a remake of The Last of Us Part 1 was reported in April of 2021 by Bloomberg News. The report claimed that the game, codenamed T1X, was in development for the PlayStation 5, having started at Sony Visual Arts Support Group Studio, but eventually moving under Naughty Dog's budget after some staff joined the production in 2020. A PlayStation Store listing for the game, titled The Last of Us Part 1, was prematurely released on June 9th of 2022, including a trailer and information about the game. The game was officially announced later that day at Summer Game Fest. It is scheduled to release for the PlayStation 5 on September 2nd of 2022, and for Windows on a later date. Naughty Dog also announced special versions of the game, granting additional in-game upgrades and skills. Development is being led by game director Matthew Gallant and creative director Shauna Skyg. Gallant had previously worked on the original game and Uncharted 4, and became lead system designer on The Last of Us Part 2, where he co-led the game's accessibility features. Skyg previously worked as creative director on Uncharted: The Lost Legacy. Development of the remake ceased by June 11th, as the game was submitted for manufacturing. According to principal environment artist Anthony Vascaro, the development did not involve any crunch, unlike several of Naughty Dog's previous games.
Hey all, so I should probably let you know that I originally planned on having this documentary out the release date of the remake. As you can probably see, that did not go according to plan. So since my original recording, there have been a lot of updates and of course the release of Part 1. Now the remake was built to take advantage of updated hardware, requiring new animations, art direction, and character models to align with the vision of the original game's development team. The visual department analyzed the original cutscenes and narrative beats to identify crucial storylines and their original direction and purpose. The team expanded upon the gameplay, technology, and accessibility features of The Last of Us Part 2, using that game's engine and building upon it with the updated technology. The cutscenes feature audio descriptions for which the developers collaborated with Descriptive Video Works. The game supports 3D audio as well as the haptic feedback and adaptive triggers of the DualSense controller. The combat system, particularly the melee, evolved using development tools from The Last of Us 2. The team felt that the original game's combat sequences were iconic and required no significant overhaul. Naughty Dog hoped that the remake would allow Part 1 and Part 2 to be played sequentially, with no technology or visual discrepancies. They felt the new audiences, such as viewers as an upcoming Last of Us project that we'll talk about later in the documentary, and new PlayStation 5 players could be reached. The remake was partially inspired by Part 2's flashback scenes, for which the team rebuilt areas and assets from the original game. And that's really all the basic stuff from the development of The Last of Us Part 1, the remake of the first game. Now, when this game was announced and trailers were announced, I, along with many others, thought that, of course, the game looked beautiful. However, people did wonder what's the point of buying this game if there really is nothing new but prettier graphics? And while this remake for the PlayStation 5 would obviously be the best version to play of the first Last of Us game, Last of Us Remastered is a perfectly playable and still widely available game and a lot cheaper than this new game. So a lot of people wondered, what's the incentive of buying this remake if you could just play the Remastered, which is pretty much just as good, just the graphics are not up to par to what this remake would be. But regardless of those criticisms, this remake was made, it was completed, and it was released on September 2nd of 2022. So, how did it do? Well, it did pretty well. According to Metacritic, it got an 89 out of 100 based off 112 critic reviews. That being said, it also got a 6 out of 10 on the user score out of over 1,200 reviews. Instead of me explaining why this game is looked at less compared to The Last of Us on the PS3 or The Last of Us Remastered, I suggest watching this video by Moist Critical or Penguin Z0 as he reviews this game, and I pretty much agree with everything that he says. Basically what it comes down to is, while this is a very good game, it's a much prettier version of an already fantastic game. It is just that it's the same game with better gameplay, better graphics. While it is definitely the best version, a lot of people don't see a reason of purchasing it, especially when a lot of people are still having trouble getting their hands on a PlayStation 5, which leads me to my next point. And while reviews are still generally good, it appears that the sales are not doing as good. While in the United Kingdom, for example, The Last of Us Part 1 topped the weekly physical sales charts within its opening weekend, and in Japan, it's the 5th best-selling retail game of its first week with 10,954 copies sold. Most of these articles are saying that sales are actually not that good, as PlayStation 5 owners are waiting for new titles and new games, not just a remake of a game that's almost a decade old. Though the most recent article is of September 22nd of this year, so who knows, The Last of Us Part 1 may have a big boost in sales. And while it seems like The Last of Us Remake didn't have the big splash Naughty Dog is hoping for, that doesn't mean this is the end of the gaming story for The Last of Us. As I mentioned earlier, there is talks and rumors of The Last of Us Part 3 being worked on. Along with that, Naughty Dog has also revealed that there's details about a standalone Last of Us multiplayer game, as Last of Us multiplayer was not included in Last of Us Part 2. So Naughty Dog wants to release its own standalone game, which it also says it has a story. There's no real big details right now, and there is no release date, but it's something to look forward to. I personally never actually played the online multiplayer, so maybe with the standalone game I'll actually give it a shot. Along with the remake, there's another form of media that The Last of Us fans can enjoy, but this isn't a video game. What we're talking about is the TV series based on the first game, that the first season is expected to debut in early 2023 and is set to air on HBO. The show will star Pedro Pascal of Mandalorian fame, and Bella Ramsey of Game of Thrones fame will be Ellie. Gabriel Luna of Marvel Agents of S.H.I.E.L.D. fame will play Tommy. Other actors that will be part of the show will be Merle Dandridge as Marlene, Anna Troy as Tess, Nico Parker as Sarah, Nick Offerman as Bill, Lamar Johnson as Henry, and Kevon Woodward as Sam. Along with them, some of the original cast from the game will make appearances within the show as well, such as Jeffrey Pierce, who portrayed Tommy in the game as a character named Perry. Troy Baker and Ashley Johnson, who played Joel and Ellie in the game, will also star in the series as undisclosed roles. The first news of the series was revealed in March of 2020. A television adaptation was announced in planning stages at HBO, expected to cover the events of the first game and possibly some parts of the sequel. Alongside Druckmann, Craig Mazin was named to help write and executive produce the series, while television producer Carolyn Strauss and Naughty Dog president Evan Wells were named additional executive producers. And the music for the show will be very familiar to the games, as Gustavo Santaolalla will be working as a composer for the show. The show was announced as a joint production of Sony Pictures Television, PlayStation Production, and Naughty Dog. It is the first show produced by PlayStation Productions. The show is produced under the company name Bear and Pearl Productions. HBO would go on to greenlit the series on November 20th of 2020. PlayStation Productions' Asad Quizobash and Carter Swan were named executive producers, and Word Games was added as a production company. In January 2021, the Mighty Mint joined production. Pre-production for the series began on March 15th of 2021 in Calgary, Alberta. Neil Druckmann actually announced that he directed an episode and felt that the experience reinforced and reflected his experience in directing games. The Last of Us is said to be the largest television production in Canadian history, expected to generate over $200 million in revenue for Alberta. According to Domaine Petty, president of the Canadian
Artists Union, the show's budget exceeds 10 million Canadian dollars per episode, while some sources suggest that the budget may be closer to $15 million per episode. So any fans of the game series who now want to watch a TV rendition starring the guy from Mandalorian and the actress from Game of Thrones will be able to do so in early 2023 when it releases on HBO. Personally, I don't have HBO, but I might actually be willing to give this a shot, especially with Ron Swanson playing Bill. I don't know, I'd find that's going to be just a little too magical. But everyone, with that, we have now covered the whole story of The Last of Us up to today. From Neil Druckmann's early life growing up in Israel, being able to witness the violence there, to attending college, to making a project for George A. Romero, the director of Night of the Living Dead, to his very own comic book, to being hired by Naughty Dog, to then working with Bruce Straley on a Jak and Daxter reboot, then with tons of work from both Bruce and Neil and the whole Naughty Dog team to create one of the best and most loved video games of all time that revolutionized cinematic storytelling within video games, to a fun and impactful DLC, to a failed movie adaptation, to another successful yet somewhat controversial sequel, to now a remake of the first game and an HBO TV adaptation. The Last of Us is really a unique series. It took the zombie genre that seemed to almost be tired and ran dry of ideas and turned it on its head, adding a new element of horror with the cordyceps fungus taking over and destroying humanity. Along with that, adding emotional, cinematic, and impactful storytelling that is rarely seen in video games. And The Last of Us has gone on to be one of the most loved, most successful, and most critically acclaimed series to date. The Last of Us series has accomplished so much more than just being a fun zombie survival video game. It has stretched across the world with its beautiful visuals, storytelling, acting, and gameplay. Even with some of the controversies and criticisms, some of the development issues, The Last of Us is still one of the best series of all time. And we have the loads of talented people who worked on these games to thank. And while this may be the end of the story right now, there is definitely more coming for this series in the future. Neil wanted The Last of Us to make a big impact on the world when it came out. He wanted to make a game that told a story that people would remember, a story that people would be impacted by, a story with characters that people can relate to and feel for and have emotions for. He and everyone at Naughty Dog wanted to create stories within these games that really made you think about your own life and the emotions of what people are willing to do when faced with a dark reality. And also, Neil Druckmann wanted to create a female character that women young and old could look up to and be inspired by, that wasn't just a sexual object. And after all of my research for this video, I can easily say that he and everyone at Naughty Dog accomplished this. The Last of Us was an ambitious undertaking by Naughty Dog and all of the staff who worked on it. But thanks to the amazing work by these team members, by these video game developers, artists, designers, musicians, they have created one of the most memorable video game experiences of our lifetime. And The Last of Us has left an impact on millions of people, myself included. And even with some of my own criticisms of Part 2, I can easily say that I'm ecstatic for whatever is coming for this series in the future. From college projects to one of the most critically acclaimed games of all time, selling close to 30 million copies. That is the story of The Last of Us, from its beginning to today. Thank you all so much for joining me on this super long video. I'll see you all next time.